Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the university. My name is Rob Duck. I'm the Dean of the School of the Environment, and I've been asked to come in and say a few words to welcome you to this afternoon's proceedings. That's me. The practice of community charrette design in the UK, a symposium that's been organised under the auspices of the Geddes Institute for Urban Research, named of course after Patrick Geddes, who used to be a member of staff here, and organised by the gentleman to my right, who I think you all know, Dr. Hussam Al-Waya. It's a great privilege to see so many of you here this afternoon, and I think you're going to have an excellent programme which should result in some very lively discussion, and I think that's the whole part of the idea. The idea of a charrette being a method of bringing experts and users together in an early stage in the design process to engender creativity. Three fantastic speakers who are here this afternoon. Sandy Robinson, the principal architect from the Scottish Government, who's the first of the three. And then all the way from the University of Hertfordshire, Susan Parham, who's the head of urbanism in the Centre for Sustainable Communities. And the third of the three, David Thompson, the lead officer for urban design with Fife Council. So a great variety of in-depth knowledge who are going to be with you this afternoon. There's also going to be some local contributions from members of the Geddes Institute, Mrs. Barbara Ilsley from our own School of the Environment, and of course Hussam himself, who's the brains behind this symposium, the second of two that he's organised in quite a short time. So I'm going to hand over now to Barbara, I think, is that right? Who's going to speak next, and I hope you have a really successful afternoon here in the university. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, well, can I have my welcome to those of the Dean, and it's been very nice to see you here today. Today's event is very much a follow-on from an event that occurred 2 weeks ago with the heading of Master Planning Process under Current Conditions, and I suspect many of you here today attended that particular symposium. And what my role here is just to, I suppose, pick up some of the themes from that earlier symposium, and also to provide a little bit of context for our speakers following after. In terms of the previous symposium, what we have here on the slide, on the left-hand side, were first of all, some of the contextual factors, the drivers of change that were seen as important in master planning. So on the left there, the issues of public life, which was all about master planning as a process of creating quality places, the kind of places that we all want to live and work in, and how we might achieve that. Of course, we can't always achieve our ideal, and on the other side of the diagram, very much about the constraints, the barriers, the realistic issues that shape what master planning is about. The fact that we need to think in terms of the efficiency of how we go about that process and bring that together with our goals and aspirations for quality places. And bringing those two things together, the context was very much about the theme of collaboration and the importance of working together in terms of trying to manage change and create sustainable places. And some of the observations or the themes that actually came out of that first symposium are down the right-hand side of the slide there. So very much about place being important, but people being important as well. The clarity of the process, being very clear to everyone what the intent is, what the objectives are and how you're going to go about it. The client. Is the client the person who's commissioned the master plan, or is it the end user in the process? And the bottom one in terms of change, the fact that you're not necessarily producing an end state plan that change is ongoing and this is just one point in the process. But the fourth bullet point there is the one I think that starts to make the link to today, particularly, because I think there was quite a lot of discussion at the previous events around collaboration and how actually we involve the stakeholders in the process. And under that heading, I think there was quite a lot of discussion around the use of charrettes. So some of the issues that were discussed in relation to charrettes were about how we engage the design, how we carry it out, and what status does the charrette have in the overall process. So that's really a kind of bit of a recap on the first symposium 2 weeks ago. So if we come on to trying to set the scene then for today's events, and in terms of our heading and practice of community charrette design in the UK. Again, if we think about some of the broad drivers or the contextual factors involved in charrettes. And the first of those is very much around the whole issue of engagement. I think undoubtedly over the last 2 decades, we've seen the whole idea of community engagement become very much ingrained in public policy formation. And not just in architecture, design, planning, placemaking, but across the whole governance sector. So whether it's health or education, it has become an accepted principle that we engage with stakeholders in designing public policy. That's part and parcel, I think, of a change in attitude to a more participative, a more deliberative form of policy making. The reasons behind it, for some it's about issues of the rights for people to be involved, and for others it's about creating better outcomes and better results. But I think there's also a debate around how successful that might be, and power can still be controlled. And so a number of writers, academics have written about the tyranny of participation. So it's not necessarily an area without discussion and debate within. So that's one aspect, and another aspect is very much about the nature of the process of engagement and the goals that there are, the values that underpin engagement factors, and the methods, and the fact that those all interrelate. You use different methods in different kind of situations. And charrettes very much, I think, fit into that overall context. And it's through making decisions around engagement, forms of engagement, the values, through that process, we actually get to the priorities and hopefully then inform the master plan process. So what we have on the right-hand side, in a sense, are some of the ideas, some of the themes that came out of the previous workshop in terms of charrettes, that in a sense are tensions and are perhaps issues that our speakers will be touching on, hopefully, as we go forward. Authenticity. So is it theatre or is it an open process? As Ambia Cornwall talked about, invited spaces and autonomous spaces. And who controls the agenda? These are all kinds of issues. What is the context? Is it about places or is it about process and style? And the actual master plan, or is it about improving the quality of where people live? How do we fit it into other processes, like the statutory planning process? Or does that give it weight? Does that give it added legitimacy or not? And some of the impact, are we looking for quick wins, or are we looking for the longer term? And so the proposition is all around responding to place by design by engaging other stakeholders. And as you can see, I'd like to believe our speakers will maybe take a slightly different tack on this issue, perhaps around these themes of collaboration, practice, and policy. So at this point, I think you're handing over to, I'm handing over to Hina to talk a little bit about her work.
Thanks. This is very thorough. Wow, thank you. Now, our just very second and quick speakers, which will take only 10 minutes, because we are having an exercise as well. So everyone in this room will take rules in this symposium. Our second speaker is Hina Hirani. Hina Hirani is an architect, I could say established architect, who work as well in industry. And I had the privilege, it was my best students for this year. She graduated with distinction in her MSc in Advanced Sustainability of the Built Environment. And her research project was about the pragmatism of design charrettes with reference, I could say, to Scotland. And she's got 4 interesting slides, and she would like to show you the contemporary survey she carried out in the summer, interviewing 25 key players in charrettes across Scotland and as well, I could say, in England, and she would like to share with all of you the outcomes of her survey.
Thank you very much. Right, thank you very much, Hussam and David, for giving me this fantastic opportunity, and I'm quite honored that all 3 of you I have interviewed for my research. Today I'm going to present my part of my research findings, and it's like quick summary. It's only 10 minutes of a presentation, and I'll start with a short background of whom did I interview and what did I ask, because it's very important to, I think I should tell you that I will validate my findings. It will be a couple of minutes slide. I have, as Hussam mentioned, that I have taken 25 interviews in total, and based on their influence, there is no particular order, but based on their influence, I have created 3 different groups. Like group 1 is expertise, independence, academia, researcher, campaign group like Planning in Scotland, and so on and so forth. And group 2 is affected. The people who affect the project, those are like professionals who have their private interest, and public interest, those who determine the context, like government body, politicians, council, and so on. And group 3, who are actually affected by the projects, like community groups, individuals, end users, habitat. So I start with the background, like what did I ask to them. My interview with 25 wide range of key players is ranging their experience from SSI Charrette-Enquire by design, Charrette-like events, master planning, then community planning and practices. So I was trying to looking the Charrette from 3-dimensional, 3 days I think out of style hours, IMX I would say. It's open-ended discussion lasting between 30 to 90 minutes. And I started with the why to do it. That was my first question. I asked 3 key questions. Why this was for me to understand and peel layers behind their motives and their drivers. Why would they involve? And it was quite fascinating story I heard from many of them why they involved in Charrette. And the next question was how did it operate? Because this was very important to understand the procedure, mechanism, governance, and so on. And the discussion wasn't just about process, but much more discussion in depth about like engagement, management, their feedback, timeline, skills and knowledge required, and collaboration and things like that. And the next question was what? So what did it deliver? This was to understand the end result, the output of the community, whether we achieved or not. How do we define the success of a Charrette? Whether Charrette is to know the value of Charrette master planning process for its delivery. So these were the 3 key questions, and then these are the findings. What did I learn about Charrette? This was my key findings. It's just appreciate it's just 10 minutes, so it's a high level summary. But if you need any further information, feel free to contact me. I got depth of data. When I started collecting the information, the different themes were started emerging, and I created 5 buckets. The reason I'm calling it buckets rather than themes is like they are not exclusive, they are interlinked for the purpose of it, for the process. So these 5 themes, which are the key issues and which ties in back with the Symposium 1. So the feedback was quite mixed and quite interesting. It depends on whom did I interview and which particular group or the individual. So for example, if I say, if I take this stakeholder engagement theme, the view was quite mixed when I interviewed group 1 and 2, which is expertise and the professional who actually deliver the projects or affect the project. They said, okay, the Charrette is quite effective, it's well plugged into the community, it's provide opportunity to increase stakeholder engagement, while group 3, community, the end user, they felt, right, it was quite nice. We've been listened and it was nice to see what's going on from day 1 to day 5 or 7. We can see the things moving very quickly. It was quite amazing, great show. But so what? We don't know whether the scheme is going to implement or not, because there were some of the frustration in terms of post-Charrette. The same question I asked about in the last Symposium 1, Charrette hangover, because they felt they haven't been included in decision-making process. Thus, the feedback loop isn't closed. So there is a wee question about that. But when I went back to the professionals, they said, okay, we got whatever we wanted out of the event, and we can move on to the next phase, and we can carry on towards the implementation of the project. So mixed views on that. Collaboration, very positive feedback on views from all 3 groups, and very nice. They say it's a vehicle for collaboration between decision makers, community and professional. So it brings everyone onto the board and all interested parties. Working collaboratively helps all interested parties to understand and support a project's rationale. Same 3, vision and outcome. This was very important point for me to ask all the peers, because this would give me the answers, all their feedback, perspective. How do they see? Because the theory part says Charrette is a visionary concept and it's outcome driven. So this is Charrette is a very effective and focused approach which increases the probability for implementation. It also promotes, and expert says it's not just that, it also promotes trust between citizens and government through the building of long-term community goodwill. So which is quite good and positive, because it gives a smoothen out the relationship. Because I'm an architect, I have got like 14 years of experience. Everyone works in their own space, while Charrette brings everyone together. So collaboration was quite positive feedback. Vision and outcome, and the next thing was accelerated timescale with the complexity. Now again, mixed views on this. Charrette being a fast-track process, it's quite intense. There are experts say there are chances to miss out all the some of the important issues because it's fast-moving. If the pre-Charrette exercise is not done properly, so in order to make it successful, you got to do the exercise pre-Charrette and post-Charrette properly. Not just that, most interviewees, they say the 5 to 7 days time frame, they are quite fine with that, because it's the short period which creates a momentum of work collaboratively, and it's vision driven. So that's quite nice. last theme was leadership. I had a very interesting mixed feedback on that, because Charrette-like events need, or I would say rather demand, a good driver to run the event successfully, not just run the event, but the whole project successfully from start to the implementation. So, and most SSCI exemplar projects were led by Duane, who is like a charismatic leader, not just a great leader, but a very good listener, and moves on with the projects, and he's got a great team, skillful team with a full resource on. So I had a feedback that if we need to mainstream this Charrette approach in master planning process, then it requires a facilitator with a good leadership to run events successfully. So we need to take care about that. And so overall feedback was fantastic, and they say Charrette being a better at understanding the need of end user like conventional planning process. So very positive feedback from all 25 interviewees. Now, what do we learn from this learning? What's necessary for change? So again, tying back to Symposium 1, it was like capability, engagement, leadership, trust, staying in power. These were the quality for making places for people. So this is what I think is needed. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Hina. This is interesting and very related. Now, we have a small exercise for all of you now before our speakers kick off. Now, just as well, I would like to refer to the beginning, just to mention that I am very grateful for Architecture Design Scotland colleagues who's been very supportive to our event last time and this time, and I am very pleased to have 3 senior people in this room who will have some roles as well in this event. My colleague Eric Dayson from Architecture Design Scotland, he will explain now the 2 main questions we proposed to all of you. You have about 6-7 minutes. And please, when you write the answer, please write it clearly before I hand over.
Hello, I'm Eric Dawson from Architecture Design Scotland. Very pleased to help support this Symposium initiative. Bart did a very good job about making mention of the links to the previous master plan exercise. And I just wanted to identify that a brief report of that event is now available on the website. And just touching on 3 issues that really were raised in relation to Charrettes on that day. Delegates raised certain points about the Charrette. Is it a drama? Is it a form of theatre where people are coming with almost preconceived ideas or pre-existing answers in terms of professional knowledge? Or are they really investing time to identify with the local people what the appropriate solutions are? Issues about the facilitator and very particular skill sets. So is it possible to open up a diverse community and derive ideas, or actually are things inhibited? And the third major point that came through was something the last speaker touched on, which is this idea of Charrette hangover. So, okay, you're in town, you're doing your newsletter, there's a lot of momentum, we're all excited about this. Get to the end of the Charrette, what are you left with? What happens next week, next month, next year? The show's left town, it's now over to you. So, with that in mind, I want to propose 2 questions. We want you to think about the answers. It's a very short exercise. What I'm going to ask you to do is turn to your neighbour, and we want you to discuss in a very short period of time this question. We're going to do 2 questions. This is the first question. What does pragmatic collaboration to guide change in places look like? 1 question, 2 people, 3 minutes. So if you could write down your answer to that, please. We're going to gather up all of your responses, and we'll make use of them later on in the session. So if you can take 3 minutes, no more than 3 minutes, please. Now think about this and jot down some thoughts. Now those thoughts will be bullet points, just a snippet, maybe a very brief sentence. Obviously not a lot of time to spend on this. What does pragmatic collaboration prevent change in places?
Please write your answer clearly, please, because we have to type all of that. Related to what Barbara explained in the two main circles. Now the second question is about the speed.
Once again, 3 minutes.
Our first speaker for today is Sandy Robinson, Principal Architect from Scottish Government. Sandy, as I said, he's been in practice for a while. He joined about 2 or 3 years ago, 3 years ago, Scottish Government. He's been the driver and working as well in issue of Charrette, and one of the, I could say, driver in the Scottish Government initiative for sustainable communities and for the new 3 initiatives as well and schemes. He will start his talk today about knowledge, dialogue, and place in regards to Charrette. Thank you. Thanks, Sandy.
Okay, this may be slightly repetitive for people because it's really, I'm going to give an overview of what Charrette is from the Scottish Government perspective, why we think it's a valuable tool, where its limitations are, we're not really sure of some of that yet, and go into some detail about some of the Charrettes that we've been involved in. But to sort of just to preface it, I sort of think the question here is about relationships. It's about parity and about how the planning process is currently negotiated, which is kind of by accident and by appeal a lot of the time. But who is in charge? You know, where is the balance of power, and where does that take you? It doesn't take you to the right sort of destination eventually. What is a charrette? It's a long sentence there, put there by a civil servant, which is of value. But just to drill down a bit further, I think they're not the be-all and end-all. I think a lot of people think that the Scottish Government thinks that charrettes are the holy grail and this is going to save the planet. They're not. They are a tool in the planning process which you can use at an appropriate time. When is that appropriate time? We're still trying to find out where they are effective and how they can be effective. It's not a consultation process that you design. This is the Scottish Government's approach to it. I think David and Susan might think differently, but the way we see it is a design process that is consultative, and that's about injecting design into planning and development stages where it previously may not exist. And it's about collaborating at early stages, at later stages, but at crucial stages. So this is sort of obviously a parody of public consultation and the planning system and how it operates some things. Because you've got an architect there, you know, sort of slightly arrogant swagger saying, what do you think of it so far? Come on to the church hall and tell us this weekend. We'll say rubbish. No, don't like that. Because a lot of planning, obviously, is about predicting the future. And if you present somebody with a proposal, then it immediately challenges them and you can be reactive with it. So you tend to get very negative responses. People say that doesn't relate to me. I don't really understand where this has come from. And I'm not up for change a lot of the time anyway. Partly because they don't understand the pressures that perhaps the town faces as a whole. And then you go around the houses with it too. So you send it to the planning authority, you send it to SEPA and Scottish Water and Transport Scotland. They'll have their little shot at it too, from their individual perspective about what they particularly think it is. And you take the roads department and they tend to say that you have a funny time with the EU because that's one of the biggest nuts we've really got to crack in Scotland. And it becomes not a dialogue, it becomes an argument. So many planning, in particular at the moment, so many planning decisions are going to appeal where things are fraught out. It's not a good use of resources at all. And the way we see it, it's not by asking what people want, it's asking what they know about the place too. It's not about creating a wish list for people, because that way lies it's appeasement of communities a lot of the time. It's ticking things off. And this is genuine feedback we've had from Charrettes too. What would you like here? Say a subway, the architect thinks one thing, but they're thinking the other. And the other classic one, which you've heard more than once, is what would you like here? They say, we'd like a new look for the town. They think, well, you need, is that public realm improvement? They say, no, what new look for the shop? That's what we actually want here. And the point is, if you ask people what they want, they'll give you an abstract fact about their desires. But if you ask them about the place, about how you inhabit it, about their relationships with other people, with the town, then you start to gain some knowledge which are clearly more significant things to have in the toolbox. So it's not like a collection of facts, it's an application of knowledge. The term itself is a problem sometimes, but it's also useful in that it's a hook. And for those of you that don't know, 19th century, they are called the Beaux-Arts. The art students, architecture students, used to work on large canvases, and when they had to deliver these canvases to be assessed, they would be collected in a cart. Charrette means cart in French. So what would happen, because art and architecture probably planning students as well, leave things until the last minute, and they would get on the cart and start finishing things off. Just do that little bit that they get around to last night. And so it became a term for working very quickly, and often a term for people working together and helping each other out with things. These are really, I suppose, the three things which I would say ministers think are important for Charrettes to do. One's about vision, so that's about pulling people together and saying it's not about what this means in terms of roads policy or in terms of SUDs, it's about the place itself. And you must understand as a professional what your role in delivering this place is. And sometimes it's about swallowing your policy because you understand what the creator, what's trying to achieve in the big picture. Engagement and energy, they are generally, if they're well run, good fun to be at. They are invigorating for communities too, which is why sometimes you can have such a bad hangover afterwards. You have a big party, the bigger the party, the bigger the aspirations that are raised, then bigger the hangover that you have. And outputs, what's really important about it is that this is why it's design-led, is that you need to draw. You need to present these things to the communities and draw what they will perceive. Draw streetscapes, draw little vignettes and sketches of places, because very often the plans themselves don't do much. We sort of had two phases of involvement in Charrettes. The first was in 2010, which was part of the Charrette series, which Anders Planning facilitated. 3 locations in Scotland, Greece, Kelly, Fife, which is the area we talk about, Grantham and Aberdeen. Very different projects, but also master planning, site specific, look at the whole time. And that seems our success. And certainly what we had actually were 5 ministers that came along to the Charrettes. That's kind of unprecedented for planning and architecture stuff. Ministers don't really come along to many of these things. But they genuinely thought this was something we could pursue. So the next phase was what we're calling a mainstreaming program. But it's about 2 things. It's about raising the profile of Charrettes and design-led collaboration. And it's about testing the boundaries as well, about where this can be applied. We ran 3 Charrettes as part of the program last year, and this, I think, is one Girvan, but obviously everything takes place on site. You set up your studio on site and walk about the town with the community. So you're getting a guided tour through somebody else's eyes. You speak to people on the street, in the place of work. And what's interesting here actually is this chap here, he's called Nick Taylor, and he came onto the Girvan Charrette as a sort of co-facilitator, and he is the regeneration manager at the council in Scarborough. And the reason he got into that was he used to be a hotel manager, and I think it was about 10 or 12 years ago. There was a charrette for Scarborough in his hotel, and he got it, he understood it completely, and he became a member of the community that was involved in taking the charrette outputs forward. It subsequently became passion and now a career for him. So you have your studio, it's working quickly, the studio's open to the public very often, lots of talking, public meetings. The important bit a lot of the time though, is what happens around the tables, because that's where people get the opportunity really to present their own voice, to make some marks on the paper, to talk about what's important to them, and to get away from the traditional issues which come up in consultation. What's wrong with this place? What's a dog mess? We need more hanging baskets. Start to talk about transport issues and about things like flooding, employment, etc. people really close by. And then allowing these people to become part of the process is crucial. So it's about feeding back. This is Charrette-Enquire, and she's pretty serious customer, Charlotte. So when she stands up and says what she thinks, to her neighbours, to her own community, then it's got more validity than I'm just saying, or any other facilitators, because she understands it well. Just some shots of this was a calendar charrette that was on. It has to be an iterative process. So you need to present things, you need to allow that to be challenged and to redesign on the basis of it. And that implies a certain length of time. What I think the Scottish Government view is on charrettes is that they need to be multi-day, really. That we've seen charrettes that have been an afternoon, but it doesn't allow for that iteration, it doesn't allow the testing of ideas. That's more of a workshop in a way. I'm not going to draw clear lines around these things because they're all value, design like engagement is a positive thing. It's about refinement, further drawing, etc. And it's about engaging people who who wouldn't come to that church hall to talk about the plan. So sometimes it means going to the pub and speaking to somebody, and asking them about their views about the place. And this is a guy who came along to the final Charrette presentation who wouldn't have been there at all. He's got a better understanding about his place. He may well decide to take some of these issues forward himself. Final presentation is important, but that is really just the end of the charrette. But the process goes on and it has to have a further life. The outputs, as I say, very graphic, things that are intelligent. You get a lot of information generated, but it has to be extremely intense. So you have some people with a sort of CAD model approach to things, deal with your design analysis, diagrams, which are reporting, things which people understand, a sketch, and say this is what it might actually look a bit like. This is what we're trying to achieve. So what is the roads policy here? What who cares? Because it looks like it's going to work. It looks like the sort of thing which is consistent with our neighbourhood and meets our needs. People producing photorealistic visuals in a short period of time can really help to capture their imagination. The pre-charrette period is really important. You need to get the right people there, so you need to get the community there, the right parts of the community. Very often means working with schools, etc., before the charrette itself. Just publicity, things like that. It will be a success if you're on the basis of things, simple things like publicity. And then you get the hangover afterwards too, which is significant. And if you overpromise at the charrette, then you run ahead of something really. But it is important to harness that energy and keep it going. So the people that come to the charrette need to take part in some of the next moves. Some of it will be for planning authority to take on, but much of it can be achieved in the community itself. My tutor in first year architecture used to say, aim high and miss, and he borrowed that from Michelangelo. But it's good advice. If you concede about your will miss, but if we lower our aspirations, then the quality of place in Scotland is not going to improve, and it really needs to, the quality of new places needs to improve. So part of that, charrettes as a model of co-production. There might be some partners there, but what you need to do is to be able to hand some of the further work to the community themselves. Various ways of doing that, and particularly calendar, government charrettes, that became a fundamental part of what we needed to achieve. So at calendar, there's an awful lot of work done on the type of models that can be taken forward. It's a complex arrangement here because they have very active community, over 100 community organisations. They have the planning authority, which is a national park, and they have a separate service provider, which is still the council. It's quite a complex setup. But they're taking that on, and to the credit of the national park said, we'll take the design outcomes and we'll make an SDG. So they're doing the work on some of the design outcomes, and that's currently for consultation with supplementary planning guidance. So that's taking the planning parts forward. Remember, the community are involved in some improvements for the public realm, and they've created a short, medium, and long-term action plan for the calendar, which the community is at the heart of. It's got a lot of momentum. Goodman, a slightly different approach, they developed a town team, which have been a successful model in the Scarborough initiative that I mentioned too. They meet every month. It's up to them to determine what they take forward. Some of it is to do with the charrette, some of it's not. Last meeting I went to, we were talking about credit union, because these are the important things that they need to take forward as a community. But the charrette allowed that to happen, and that becomes an important vehicle for delaying the hanging, or at least, or moving things forward so that the momentum is maintained. And it's become important to the community because it's their thing. The local authority are involved in it, but fundamentally it's something. And the charrette basically leveled it out. So it's just meter played out by charlatans, predetermined plan that they just roll out. It's kind of possible, probable, and it does occur. But it's a Lance Armstrong approach. You know, it's cheating. It's cheating, and it's wrong. It shouldn't happen. And if you've got talented designers, which are absolutely crucial, if you've got a strong client, and if you get a community buy-in at an early stage, then it's much harder to hoodwink. You may not build it. You may not actually build a charrette master plan, because you do it in about 4 or 5 days. But fundamentally, the principles that there are strong, and what you need to do is build on it as well. So the decisions that are made at the charrette are fundamentally important to the community. They should be seen as a material planning consideration, but it doesn't mean to say that that is going to be a hotel, and that is going to be a museum space.
Our next speakers for today, Dr. Suzanne Baham. She is the head of urbanism in Hertfordshire University, and I'm very grateful she came all the way today from Hertfordshire University. She is an established figure, worked in industry as an urban designer and consultant for 13 years, and I believe she is teaching at the moment as well and practicing charrette in the university through undergraduate and MSc course, and I believe they've got a case study where they run charrette inside the university with council in that area. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hassan. I just wanted to check, can you hear me without the this stuff?
Yeah.
I think I've got the kind of carrying Australian voice. Obviously from generations of herding sheep. But let me know if can't hear me, I'll put all the kit on. Okay, thanks very much, Hassan. So I wanted to talk about the practice of charrettes. The same is, in a way, we're going to cover some similar territory, but show you some different examples. So I hope you won't get too bored and it's too much repetition. But I guess one thing that's clear to me is that we've got lots of areas of kind of agreement, which I think is rather reassuring, actually. It's really nice to be speaking at the Geddes Institute. One of the writers who first turned me on to sort of town planning, urban design, political economy of cities, thinking about landscape was Patrick Geddes, and I loved his work. So it's very nice for me. It's kind of great sort of a feedback loop for me from sort of 30 years ago. So it's a real pleasure for me to actually be here where Patrick Geddes was on the staff. It's fantastic. Righty-ho. Yes, I want to talk about some charrettes that I've worked on in different places around the world. In fact, the first charrette I worked on was in Australia a very long time ago. And then I didn't get a chance to do much work on charrettes for quite a while. But when I came to live in Europe in the 90s, I started getting connected up with people who were interested in doing charrettes and got a chance to be involved in charrette practice again. And I now, as Sam says, I teach people about charrettes, both for continuing professional education and in master's courses at the University of Hertfordshire, as well as getting to do a bit of charrette practice when I can. Oh, hang on a minute. So what I want to talk about a little bit is about the sort of background and theory of charrettes. A little bit about theory to practice, engagement through charrettes, examples from practice, the critique, and where to from here. And in a way that covers a bit of territory to Sandy, so I'll flip through quickly where I think that we're going to duplicate. As others have said, Barbara talked about the whole way that the charrette process fits within broader trends, if you like, political and social trends. in terms of participation in planning. And I think what's clear is that charrettes have benefited from the fact that participation, consultation, engagement have moved from the margins to the mainstream of much of our work in planning. The citizen activist movements of the 50s, more in the 60s and 70s, where people decided they didn't like the shape of modernism, for instance, that they didn't like things that were happening through kind of industrial and post-industrial capitalism, and started to make a fuss about it. Bottom-up movements really did shift the ground in the way that space is governed. And we now find that, formally at least, participation is part of our planning regimes. And I think Sandy's sort of touched on the fact that, and Barbara too, that that's not necessarily the same thing as actually having profound effects on the way that planning is done, even though it is formally part of it. We do have issues about the state's legitimacy as planning authority and problems with the what's called the democratic deficit. I thought it was very interesting that President Obama voted early to remind people that they could vote. You know, I think sort of problems of participative democracy are very clear to us these days. So charrettes can reflect, I think, a more reflexive, a nice academic word, but a more kind of self-conscious, if you like, more sort of a sense that people understand why they want to get involved in things and what benefits it might bring. So for me, a kind of key background to charrettes is the whole idea of sustainable urbanism. And this is, you know, just before the crash, the Princess Foundation, someone at the Princess Foundation for building urban communities, talked about why you might want to value urbanism and what it might constitute. For me, you know, the fact that is that we probably won't do as much development, but in terms of what we do, we need to be thinking about the same kinds of things. So that hasn't really changed. Yeah, I'm not going to bore you by going through principles that you're no doubt very familiar with, but I think, you know, again, talking about proper shaping of regional space, based on catchments, nodes of intensity, sorting out transport and connectivity, getting proper blocks, street patterns and block structures, building outdoor rooms, avoiding the kind of dendritic suburban shaping that makes people have to walk much further than they need, sorting out environmental aspects of sustainability through sustainable drainage systems, kind of food-centeredness, you know, etc., etc. There's a whole lot more, but that for me is a kind of sort of design, if you like, a kind of urbanism backdrop to doing charrettes. Of course, charrettes are also about participation, and we've had, I think, quite a lot of discussion about what is really authentic participation. And of course, everyone's familiar with the Unsense ladder of participation, and since then there's been a critique of that. People have kind of moved past that and talking about engagement as forms of incorporation in which the state gets people to be involved in things in order to pursue in Sandy's pointing out, you know, a kind of preordained plan. So, you know, I'm not trying to be naive about this. Engagement and participation can be done in quite an inauthentic way, in quite a cynical way. For me, charrettes, because of some of the inherent qualities of charrettes, they're actually pretty good at avoiding that, but we'll see what you think. Okay. As I said, charrette process for me about kind of the way that engagement has moved to the centre of things, and that this sort of language of engagement now permeates the way we think about built environment and much else. Of course, you can choose not to play the game. Some people just decide not to be involved in any of these kinds of stakeholder and kind of partnership processes because they feel that they're going to be co-opted and that their involvement will give legitimacy to outcomes that they don't sign up for. So it's not always right. However, as I said, you know, we now see this as being part of public policy. Can charrettes move us past the ethics of incorporation? Okay, so I want to talk about engagement through charrette practice in a more specific way. For me, I think Sandra made the point that charrettes aren't the right thing to do in every circumstance. That there are times when it's not appropriate to do a charrette, when a charrette isn't what's going to work. And anyway, there's a kind of palette of different methods, and I've only mentioned some of them. These are just happy ones that I've done. Where you might get a kind of combo of things that will work depending on the kind of design problem or design issues that you're facing. So, you know, one can't assume that a charrette will always be the first thing that you consider doing. what is a charrette, and again, Sandy talked about this. Here's a couple of relatively pertinent or current definitions. The Town Paper, American Urbanist publication. It's pretty similar to one you quoted, Sandy, so I think it's a bit like Bronwyn's definition of sustainability. We've seen it tweaked, but it's still pretty much fit for purpose. I'm less happy about the one from Kingston, actually, because again, that seems to be kind of like an architect's notion of what a charrette is. A charrette, they're really saying, a charrette's us getting together doing design and then telling people about it. I mean, that's sort of how I read that one. It's more of that kind of thing, in which they're really saying the designer is still king, or less likely queen. You know, and so our expertise trumps your participation. A really good charrette doesn't do that. You know, the designer's not better or more valid than anyone else's input. So we've been through this, go to Beaux-Arts, so I won't talk about that. Then how it's structured really matters. It has to be happening where the problem is, where the design issue is. As has been said by Kusang, by Hina, and by Sandy, the charrette is not just the intensive design exercise, the workshop. Quite often there's months of preparation. You're doing baseline work, you're engaging with people, you're finding out all the data, you're making sure that you map all the stakeholders that need to be there, you're kind of priming people to be involved in the whole process. It's only then that you really are in a position to actually run a really successful collaborative event, which might be 3, 5, 7, sometimes 10 days. And then again, the follow-up, and Sandy often shows some very interesting examples of how to do that follow-up and how to make it right community-based. I'll show some examples of follow-up that I've been involved in. In the NCI system, this is the National Charrette Institute from the United States, based in Portland, Oregon. They talk about these 3 phases. They take a very kind of project management kind of approach to charrettes. And, you know, that's actually quite useful because it helps people to be very clear about what they're doing when. But, you know, you're doing this careful research and analysis. You then have the multiple-day charrette, maximising people's opportunity to collaborate, and then you've got this kind of safety net for engaging those you might have missed, and following up to make sure that you get, you know, that you haven't missed out getting that last feedback loop happening. So it's important that you're encouraging participation from everyone. You know, ultimately, as the NCI says, the purpose is to give all participants enough information to make good decisions during the planning process. And I guess something that Sandy sort of said in a different way, and perhaps more engagement with more pictures, is that you know, the issues are aired live. They're explored and tested. It's parallel, not serial. It's not like, you know, one of people comes along and having a go and somebody else does it separately. Everybody has to kind of integrate with everyone else's perspectives. So you're not allowed to just cling on to your own perspective without thinking about the implications for others. It's audited. You know, you can see the process and it's transparent. And perspectives are all actively sought. It's not just a reactive thing which you're waiting to hear from people. You're actually going out there and trying to find out what they think. And this issue of feedback loops really matter. Sandy, as Sandy pointed out, it's iterative. You know, you're actually in the kind of charrettes that I teach people to do, you tend to have 3 feedback loops. You know, you come up with concepts, you develop alternatives, you have public review, you then do refinement, and then you come up with a plan and possibly other documentation and products that kind of charrette. So here's just an example from a possible redesigned charrette, where they show that kind of public vision, alternative plans, and what kind of input, review, final plan, leading to public confirmation, if you've got it right. Okay, I wanted to show you a few examples of some of my practice, and so there's a few more pictures here, so I'm fun. As I said, the NCI does a particular kind of charrette. We've been involved in some charrettes, and my university's been involved in some charrettes in the past. I'm going to show you some of those. The Princess Foundation does something called Inquiry Design, pretty similar, and they've kind of left. I guess they've kind of, I shouldn't speak for them, but my impression looking from the outside is that they've kind of developed a process which really works to, you know, it's a design process with participation in it, and I think that's absolutely critical. And I've worked with INBAL, International Network for Traditional Building Architecture and Urbanism, and CEU, the Council of European Urbanism, on the concept of charrettes in various places, not in Cuba, but a number in Norway and Romania, but they also have worked in Cuba and other places. Right, the ED process, as I said, I think is somewhat similar to the charrette. If you look at what they say about it, you know, a lot of common ground there. And just some examples, they've worked in places in Somerset, Wales, These are often simply big places which are kind of brownfield sites which are being redeveloped. But they're also, I've also heard once they've done a series of small-scale charrettes around a number of villages in the rural environment. So they've looked at different kinds of contexts. Here they are in Hampshire. Right, then moving on to charrettes that I've actually worked on. For some reason, I've ended up getting a lot of invited to run a lot of charrettes in rural Norway. No idea how that happened, but it did. And they had some interesting issues. These are kind of small towns that kind of grew up in a kind of dribs and drabs kind of way. As you can see, this one, Fjord, is actually a salmon fishing centre. It's a very incredibly beautiful site, but it's sort of mini straw, if you like. Stuff just got kind of plonked down, and it doesn't have a very good urban structure. They were aware that to maintain their tourism potential and to go on being a kind of thriving rural community, they really needed to sort out the kind of physical shape and the kind of social spaces of the town. And so they invited the Norwegian team and some foreign people, including me, to be involved in the charrette process there. We did all the things Sandy talked about in the charrettes he showed you, the kind of walkarounds, the scoping, briefing with the team, interim feedback to the local community. But something that the Norwegians have really specialised in is running a charrette and at the same time running a kind of planning course on the side. So they involved a whole lot of students, and I ran the planning course part of it. What we found was that over time, those students started to become kind of integrate with the professional design team and with the community. So we ended up with these separate strands coming together as people became more adept in the charrette process. Matthew Hardy, who's something led that slide, developed an idea of doing a kind of voting system on architectural style. We didn't want to get stuck, with people arguing the point about architectural style. So we found out that something like 80% of people like local vernacular, 15% like the vernacular in the region, and 5% like modernist buildings. So when we drew up our proposals for the town, they were the percentages in stylistic terms that we showed of the different building facades and treatments. And people thought that kind of worked, it seemed to reflect where they're at. Our charrette leader, and going to that issue of the importance of the charrette leader, Arne Sørdal, who's a Norwegian architect and urbanist, it was incredibly important that Arne was a very adept charrette leader who could listen well, could project manage, was an excellent designer, was able to kind of keep all the kind of threads working together. And I can't kind of overstate how important it is, as I think as Hina found in her research, to have somebody who has those qualities. They're not manipulating people, but helping to kind of facilitate and allow people to achieve the kind of outcomes in a very pressured, very intense, short time frame sort of environment. As you can see, we started to fill in the town, if you like. It had kind of a proto structure, but it needed to kind of make that work together, and you can see we're starting to give it some better structure there. And Norwegians are also really into system democracy. They like voting. So what happened was the town council came in every night at 6 p.m. and kind of like gave us the thumbs up or down about where we got to. And then at in the interim public meeting at the end, the townspeople came in and they basically voted about whether they thought we got it right and they wanted to have the charrette reflected in their local plan. And as you can see, they pretty much did think it was a good idea. Another Norwegian charrette I worked on was a place called Rogalandshire. This was a kind of settlement that grew up around a truck stop. The Norwegians used to basically get around by going on a boat up the edge, and in the interior it was just very small rural settlements. But then when they started a big sort of highway system through kind of Norwegian countryside, these settlements kind of grew up in a sort of incoherent way. One thing they also very much like is blowing things up. They completely seem to be obsessed with dynamiting tunnels and doing that sort of stuff. And I found that even in the sort of the young planners and architects who I was working with on this charrette suggested that part of what we should do with this town was to blow a very big hole in a kind of escarpment at the back so that we could make up some more space for car parking. And this just seemed very normal to Norwegians. So that was just an interesting, I thought, kind of aspect of Norwegian charrette work that perhaps hasn't come up in Scotland so much. But I guess if you've pioneered use of dynamite, it's something that you kind of want to make use of in the future. Anyway, so similar kind of process, finding out more about the town, scoping, getting views about what people know, kind of iterative feedback and voting, and the actual design work itself. We did a staged master plan. One of the very good things that was going to happen in this town was that they were going to become a stop on a regional railway. So they had the chance to become a more transit-oriented development as well as their highway interface. We were going to turn the town towards the rail stop, which is kind of over this side. And we had a staged program of developing up the empty spaces in the town and turning it into proper block structures over a sort of 30-year period. Okay, switching, segue here, just switching to Transylvania. But again, I don't know quite how it happened that I also started getting asked to work on charrettes in Transylvania, but it did. And so I've worked on 4 charrette processes in Transylvania, I think, since the early 2000s. Here's one in the Marmuresh area, which is just bordering Ukraine. It's a very obscure part of Europe, actually, but they still have bears, wildflower meadows, all sorts of things that actually aren't around the place in many other places. And there's still a fairly traditional village life going on, where people are sort of using scythes to cut the hay, getting around with horse and cart, and at the same time, as you can see, there's people driving past in their cars. So it's a little bit, there's this funny kind of feeling of pre-modern and modern kind of interconnected. The women in the village, very feisty, still having a very traditional way of life, but with really interesting views on modernity and on how the future of the place ought to work. So again, we did a formal charrette with a planning course with students on the side. This is Mihai Baku, who I've recently worked with again. He ran his first charrette this year himself. You can see he got into the process. Same kind of thing that Sam talked about, same kind of process. One thing that's probably worth noting is that in this circumstance, we had almost no technology, no kit. There was no broadband access or anything like that. Getting hold of a photocopier was actually quite difficult to do. And it really showed that you can do a kind of charrette with no frills. It cost almost nothing. And, if you had goodwill, paper and pencils and tracing paper, you can get a very long way in pursuing a charrette process. As I said, the women in the village, this is them telling the mayor what's what. And I don't know whether that's happened in Scottish charrettes where the ministers came, whether they got an earful from people. But, the women in the village, they were real movers and shakers. And they were, I think, one of the most sort of valuable stakeholders in running the Marlborough charrette. What the outcomes of that charrette have now been adopted by the region in their planned urban general plan. Unusually, because it was next door to a big national park, they had planning control over this village. They were able, unusually, to have very direct sort of adoption of the master planning outcomes of the charrette into their planning and their strategic and statutory planning for the area. It doesn't usually happen in quite such a direct way. Earlier on, we also worked in a charrette process. My first one in a place called Lazare, further south near the Carpathians, where they had real issues of dealing with the appalling housing conditions of the local Roma people. In the late 80s, early 90s, when the Berlin Wall fell, the ethnic Germans, the Saxons who lived in Transylvania for 800 years, were allowed to come back to Germany because they were still seen as Germans, and 90% of them went. So you ended up with rural communities, villages all around Transylvania, the Saxon villages of Transylvania, which had basically lost most of their population. And also the kind of economic base, there'd been, the Saxons had employed local Roma people to do agricultural labour, to do roof tiling, the experts in copper work and all sorts of things. Anyway, that all kind of fell apart. So on one hand, they were about to get into the EU, and so there was about to be a lot richer. At the same time, their economic base kind of was a mess. So there were real issues there, and we worked on both the kind of physical design aspects, on cultural heritage, and on specific, very vexed issues. You know, for example, the Roma's terrible living and the terrible living conditions. And we're talking about hangovers after charrettes. I think on this charrette there are a fair few hangovers during the charrette. Because one thing that happens in this region is that when you arrive, everybody gives you this thing called suika. It's a kind of plum brandy. It's absolutely lethal. It's extremely rude not to drink it. So I think someone's got permanently just a little bit drunk for the entire week that we were working on the charrette. And then that may actually be a vital strategy for dealing with the intensity of charrette activity. Okay, and then most recently, I haven't gone too much there. Most recently, in the summer this year, I worked on a Fagarash Atelier de Urbanism in Romania. But that's basically a charrette type process in a town called the Carpathians, or Fagarash, which has got this incredible castle, but the rest of the town is sort of a bit of a mess. And it's also got a kind of shadow town. It used to be a centre for munitions and chemical industry. So it's got this absolutely vast area, bigger than the town. No go area, a bit like a kind of mini Chernobyl where it's all wooded now. You can't go in there because you might step on a mine and you're thermally poisoned by all the stuff that's there. So it's got some quite odd sort of urbanism. Anyway, Mihai, who had worked on one of the earlier charrettes, this is his hometown. He persuaded the local authority that it was a good idea to sponsor this kind of process and invited me to help him run it. And we worked with architecture and urbanism students and some stakeholders from the town, specifically looking at how to deal with the area around the castle and the main square. This is a picture of it in the past, because they see this castle as being, you know, a real asset to them in tourism terms, and they're wanting to find ways of maintaining their kind of economic health place, and this is one way to do it. So, we worked together on this, redeveloping these areas of the town. Just a couple of visualisations. That's the town square as it is, kind of swamped by cars and a mess. This is our proposal. The views towards the castle when you arrive, and it ought to be a kind of really beautiful front door of the town that looks like this. And we again proposed some urbanist changes to that. Again, the local authority has said that they're going to now do work, a follow-up work from the charrette, to try to bring to fruition the master planning proposals that the charrette proposed. Closer to home, just touch very briefly on a couple of charrettes that have happened in Hertfordshire. This one was interesting because it was a charrette at a regional scale, and it was looking at the possibilities for how you would do the design for settlement. What kind of settlement patterns might work across Hertfordshire in future, and it came up with actually 6 different kinds of patterns, some of which touched on the background of the county in governed cities and in more recently new towns, but also going back to its market towns and its earlier Roman settlements and its possibilities to both meet housing need and growth of population, but to avoid the problems of urban sprawl, which were already an issue there. I think, given our current discussion about what's going on with Greenbelt, it'll be interesting to see whether this sticks, but it certainly came up with some good proposals. Andreas Duane is some names recognising that he was involved as a facilitator of a charrette leader on that one. And then there was the old Hatfield charrette, where I work in Hatfield at University. There's a new town on one side of the railway line and the old town on the other. And they don't kind of interconnect very well. But this charrette process, which was sponsored by the local landowner, Lord Salisbury, who's also the Chancellor of my university, proposed a kind of staged program of improvements to sort out Old Hatfield itself and also to re-knit it across the A1000, the Great North Road, towards the new town. And one of the outcomes, two outcomes of that are now currently being designed. Salisbury Square, which is the main square in Old Hatfield, is currently being developed with specific design proposals, and that's going to be happening over the next year or so. And fortunately, the station has just got a bit over £6 million for a redevelopment, and that's going to pick up on proposals that came out of the Happy Charrette. So that was an unusual example in which, because these were good ideas that come out of the Charrette, they were helped for stakeholders, a partnership, to be able to argue for funding to improve a kind of transport-oriented development around the station. And so it shows, I think, the kind of the value that a Charrette can bring, that you've thought about the design issue and you've come up with good ideas and it puts you in a better position to actually get money to do stuff. Another Charrette that one of my colleagues, Ian Sini, was involved in was at Deptford Creekside, when we're teaching on Charrettes, then there's a very amusing presentation about how scary some of the stakeholders were at Deptford. And she was told in no uncertain terms that she stuffed up the Charrette, she'd be meeting them in a dark alley somewhere. So, you know, Charrettes can mean living quite dangerously. And I won't teach this subject, but other colleagues of mine from Turnberry have also been involved in Charrettes in Scotland. And similar kinds of issues that Sandy talked about. Actually, a point Sandy made about whether you can actually squeeze a Charrette down into a day or an afternoon, I actually think you're right. I've tried out doing sort of what I call mini Charrettes, doing just a kind of one feedback loop with people. And yeah, you know, they're interesting and fun, and you do start to be able to play around with some of the Charrette ideas, but I don't really think you can actually do a proper Charrette in a day. You know, you can do something that sort of gets you started, especially for a kind of a small scale issue, if you like, or something about a building, for instance. But yeah, I guess I would agree that for a Charrette to really work, you probably need to do the kind of process that we've both talked about. Master planning. I wanted to put this in because I just think that we shouldn't see Charrettes as being completely disconnected from the whole idea of master planning. I mean, I think, you know, good master planners have been doing things which are probably pretty similar to Charrettes in plenty of places around the UK for years. Perhaps the major difference is that, you know, there's still the kind of master planner and the client reserve the right to not really take any notice of community views. In a Charrette, you can't get away with that, unfortunately, and nor should you. And then just getting onto a little bit on the critique about Charrettes, and I'll speed up this up. You know, it has got obvious strengths. Saving time and money, increasing the probability of implementation, promoting trust between those involved, and resulting in the best sustainable design. And I think, you know, your research found that too, and Sandy pointed to that as well. But argued weaknesses, and I think these are worth thinking about. You know, it's not the only way to do things, and there will be circumstances where it isn't actually appropriate. And I think I would agree that I have seen examples where the facilitator can be, you know, it can be less authentic than you might hope, because they may well have a plan in the bottom drawer that, you know, they've started with and they're going to end up with. Fortunately, I have rarely seen that with anyone I've worked with, or I haven't actually with anyone I've worked with, but other ones I've looked at, I've got the impression that that's what's happened. The last government in the UK was pretty keen on consultative planning, and Charrettes fitted nicely, I feel, within that whole kind of thinking. Moving on, the Localism Act and the National Planning Policy Framework explicitly says positive things about Charrette-type processes, and you know that one would think theoretically that's a very good sign about the potential for the use of Charrettes. I guess I'm kind of anxious or nervous, if you like, given the sort of the likelihood, I guess, that there are less resources for planning, the problems we have more broadly, structural problems in the economy, which mean that development is being stymied, and I guess the kind of issues we have about tying growth to what I think is likely to produce some sprawl urbanism type effects. So I guess I see the current context for doing Charrette processes as being quite a difficult one. And I do think that what you're doing in Scotland, I mean, you're just well ahead of us in England. In your thinking about Charrettes, in the work you've done on Charrettes, and just, you know, that not only have you done it for a series, but you've also done it for mainstreaming Charrettes. So, I'm not going to go into wanted to say that, you know, it's nice to come to a place where you have done such excellent work and you're already at a stage where you're critiquing your own process and progress you've made and thinking in a very refined way about where to in the future. So, you know, that's, you know, it's really good to see that happening. And I wish that we were as far ahead in England and Wales as you are here. So, again, I'm not going to, because I think that's covering work that you've already talked about. So, yeah, where to next then? This is my second to last slide. So, you know, I think there's the possibility that Charrette gives us a kind of expanded role for communities in the third sector planning places. You know, what was traditionally a very top-down, a very kind of experts-only kind of process, Charrette's really open all that up. You know, we have this context of both incorporation and increasing radicalism, but I think Charrette's can pick up on those in a positive way and kind of help them to engage in ways which are going to produce better outcomes, rather than having to stand on the sidelines and kind of saying this is all really bad and I don't want to be involved in it. I mean, in terms of structural issues, for me, Charrettes make much more explicit who plans, who decides how we do things. But for me, a remaining question, I guess, is how do we get Charrettes perhaps to deal with these big bits of kit, where I think government's pretty much saying, look, that's technical, that's stuff that communities are just going to have to wear, you know, we need to sort out, you know, highways, nuclear power, you know, big scale things like smart grids, you know, what we do about waste and pollution. You know, I would like to see us trying to find ways to get Charrettes to engage with the issues at that scale, because they are going to really reshape our landscapes and have profound effects on all of us. And I think there may be some scope for thinking about Charrettes at that scale, and I'd like to get your views on that. Yeah, sorry, as I said, at this big scale, who gets to decide on this stuff? Can we connect Charrettes up to that? Okay, I can't quite see that, but that was me forced to dress up as a in traditional clothes in a Romanian village. So if you watch out, if you go and work at a Charrette in Romania, this could happen to you too. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Thank you. Our next speakers, or the third speakers for today, is David Thompson. He is lead urban designer in Fife Council. David has been one of the main drivers, I could say, in his council towards Charrette and community engagement, and he's been heavily involved in the Loch Ellie Charrette. David, for the last 3-4 years as well, he's been a frequent visitor in Dundee University as well, teaching in architecture and planning and teaching Charrette as well. Plus, he engaged heavily in various design symposium, especially with Architecture Design Scotland, and act as a facilitator. And we recently, both of us, we engaged in air-shared symposium. He will talk about place form framework, especially learning from Charrettes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for having me back. I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. Partly because it's 3:20 and it's Friday. People have possibly got other ideas for life. So, what I'm going to think about is one thing I've been caught out on is by trying to, perhaps internally sometimes, think about doing things differently. I've been challenged, why are we actually doing anything different? What's wrong with the place we're starting from? And that's all. You were picking up the box, looks brilliant, what you've done with that. So this is where I start now. And there were 2 slides that I saw recently from the improvement service. And I use this as my own challenge if I'm trying to pitch an idea to someone else. Is anything different at the moment? And the first idea is, do we need to innovate? Does the system we have about planning give us what we want at the moment? You can ask yourself the question, is it that? So the innovation space is limited. Maybe we don't need to do too much at the moment, but things start to need to change if we think our current needs aren't being met. And Sandy was given an idea about the quality of development and the quality of decisions. So we're starting to think there is actually a potential need to do something different. So the question is there an opportunity? I thought this was quite interesting in Charrettes. It's almost flips into what's happening in England. We're trying to make an argument, but is there an opportunity to put the argument into that area? So hopefully this might give you something to do. I thought it was interesting that planning is saying something about planning. All it says about planning is speed. It's almost a subset that we have issues about quality, customer, and resource. So if you're thinking about charrettes and policy, this is the system we're trying to think about getting design into in the process. What I went to as well, I think business has some very interesting points to make on this. And someone who earns a couple of £1 billion has probably got some credibility in what he's saying. Probably earns more speak votes than people in the room, certainly me. So he's saying, actually, if you're faster, better, cheaper, more convenient, if you're a startup company, you're likely to have the right context to do something different. So I thought this was quite interesting. And if you're putting planning measures against the conditions where a business or trying to create a context for change, some really interesting parallels. We're starting to see the same thing. So the conditions are, how do we make it faster, better, cheaper, and convenient? Well, we're talking about speed measures up with speed and faster clearly go together, better and quality. We've got cheaper. We're all really keen about resources at the moment. And customers, very much Charrettes are focused on who are the audience and the customers. We're talking about convenience. So as it will come through the presentation, I've tried to think about how this might come through. Clearly, what we're being told is that everyone is a part of the planning system, so it's supposed to be a global operation. So the trick for me is, if you're making a pitch for a charrette, and this perhaps is the same conversation we can pick up on after this, is how do we make it faster, better, and cheaper? If, regardless of what we believe design and planning should do, if we're being told these are the measures, we've got to try and make an argument to go to the people who make key decisions, they're the people we've got to change. So the question is, are design-led approaches the answer? I prefer to believe that is the case. So to make that clear at the beginning. So what I wanted to focus upon are three key areas really. Understanding requirements and planning. The idea that it has to happen. What we have to plan has to happen. And then the idea that it has to matter. You said we were going to do one thing to put me on. Succeeded.
Is this the good thing? Yeah.
Yeah. What I was trying to understand was, how does this translate into something we can talk about for charrettes? Effectively, we're talking about understanding the requirements, talking about collaboration, talking about it has to happen, it has to be delivery. We have to stop talking at some point to understand how things actually get built. And then thirdly, does it matter? It translates to outcomes, something I'll come on to at the end as well. So we can sharpen up the design-led process into these three areas, I believe, in the debate. So we've had the definition. So the interesting point is this idea about specialised. We've heard different approaches from some Susan so far. So we're firmly in the arena of understanding the planning, understanding the requirements, trying to understand what we actually want to do. Do we actually want to do a fixed master plan? Do we want to talk about a regeneration strategy? Is it an estate management issue? Actually, what is the question? We're setting up a process that we don't quite know what the answer is going to be yet, so what do we do? I thought it was useful as well, it's a couple of slides I use as well, but it's just to touch upon what we actually do in planning. And it's just to give people an idea of where there are different levels of how we can engage in this aspect of it. And we're down probably here with the partnership proposals of the system. What Harry Burns talks about as well, who's the Scotland's Chief Medical Officer, is this idea of co-production. And And I added that on after listening to him speak. He articulated it extraordinarily well as to why we need co-production. I found this slide quite interesting. It's a company called Dialogue by Design who operates in London. And they were just trying to spell out really how, what we talked about, sort of expectations from charrettes. When you're in the room and you're telling people, you're asking them a question, well, they think that what you're going to tell them might happen or it might change something. But what they think is actually going to happen. So I actually tried to put a slide like this thing to try and tell people actually what we're trying to do is, you know, the expectations are going to be more shared, we're going to get something more in common. So we're trying to get an idea of ownership, much more shared over the process. So clusters planning, we talked about how to get engagement going. Really, we're thinking about design. I just wanted to emphasise here is that we talked about the role almost of the person who runs a charrette. And we've got to get across this idea there is no single solution. So we're starting from almost zero, we're coming into a particular situation. It gets away from this idea of a role of plan or something that comes in a ready-made strategy. Being very clear we're starting from almost zero. But there are some common qualities. Sam, you know these off by heart, obviously, but this is the system we have to try to understand the qualities that come forward into Scottish design. The 6 qualities that design in places tell us that are the overarching principles on which everything else is based. The key message is it's a process. There are many, many ways to do design, do charrettes, do design-led engagement. But the fundamental thing that I think we're trying to get across really is that there is a process involved in this. The process bends and changes every single time. So I thought halfway through I was just changing my understanding of the definition. And I was just writing, well, actually, is it a design team to create a test place brief? Provide a place brief. We're thinking about, do we now understand the issues we need to solve in a particular settlement or a particular neighbourhood? And that's coming off the work from the Design Skills Symposium, working with the Academy of Architecture from Amsterdam, where the expertise in this is very, very good. We've great experience learning from that. And then we're into a tailored program of stakeholder engagement. Again, that's interesting because we're not predetermining how many days or what it should do, or how many workshops we should run, or what it should actually be called. It's almost impossible to know in advance as to how that might happen, so we need to be thinking about that. And then this idea about something that's place-specific or consensus-driven. You're starting to get an idea of a theme coming through. Well, you're then asking the question, whose consensus is it? Are we talking strategic, perhaps key agencies who deal with major transportation, or we're trying to get a lobbyist? What level are we starting to pitch at? So I thought that over the debate, I'm just trying to get some understanding from my understanding as well. Sandy's articulated what the SSEI process is about, but I was just trying to think about the key word really, and the one that keeps coming up is life. What we're trying to do with planning great places is not really about trying to get the best building or the best streets. We're trying to make places livable and the best quality for people to live their lives, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We can do that by getting places looking good and functioning well. It's about quality of life. So Sandy's covered this in detail. We all wanted 3 charrettes, 68 submissions. And for me, I do a separate presentation on looking at the planning system, but effectively with the planning system locates development and gives it form, tells it where to go, you're going to go to that particular place, and then it's going to be coded, maybe some streets or blocks and spaces. And I thought about, well actually this process is actually trying to bring people into it. So we're trying to understand location for the people is a way of guiding through. So we're now into, so that's a bit of context. It's just a few images from Lockyer itself. It does have some very, very good assets. It has had money spent on it over the past 10 years as well. There's been an awful lot of regeneration, I suppose in terms of public realm, new buildings have gone in. But there's an enormous legacy of, I suppose, social housing all the way from the 50s and 60s. But there is something of a historic urban grid is intact in the centre as well. So there's a lot to work with. Just a quick slide to show another example of a setup. each town is different. So I think one of the challenges I've discussed before is how you actually run a charrette, particularly in some of the smaller places that don't have big spaces or community venues. In this case, we had to use 3 separate venues. One being, there was an institute in the middle of town that we managed to house 13 architects. We used a pub across the road, which was secured the night before the event took place. And we used the town hall for the major public presentations. But one of the learning lessons from that was that the people were actually forced to move between the venues so you could capture people and have conversations. So it was great to actually have these 3 separate venues. And I think I probably do that again and avoid having this mass, this single location. I think it works very well. So this is a slide I've used a number of times, but in terms of detail, I was always, from an urban design practitioner's perspective, I had to do an inverse role, and I should try to bring all of the people into the event, try to get an understanding of how they can engage at different times. So all I had to do really was think about who the potential audiences might be. So the key people, and you'll hear a lot about politicians bashing the planning system. People that make all the decisions in planning are politicians. I regularly get my recommendation for design refused it, overturned the committee. It's not me that makes the decision. So the important thing in the Charrette processes, as we've seen, is to get the mayors, get the politicians embedded in the project teams. So we've made the decision from day one to bring all the politicians right into the process. I'll come on to the legacy of that later on. All 3,200 homes were handed pre-Charrette paper, and we used all the existing community structures to do this, so we didn't reinvent anything, we just found out who was important in the places and who was operating. What the example I used before is this idea of the school's postcard. The idea that actually the school catchments and the chat at the school gates is more effective than anything I can do or anyone else can do to advertise this process. And then it's all face-to-face groupings as well. I got, my fair share of bashing from this person who's talking about ringtone and my phone and rubbish and all this sort of thing as well. But it's great. There's a lot of good interaction. And this was this is the Youth Forum and the Lockgate Community Development Forum, all trying to get involved before the Charrette. And what I used was the place check method of taking them round, just to get them used to this language. And this was something we discussed in the interviews. When people are getting a Charrette almost done to them, invited in, there's a brand new sort of diaspora of language coming through. So how do you get these people involved or upskilled to be able to have a role in that process? Just a couple of slides on what Gelly Charrette. I'm not going to get too much into the detail, but just in terms of the techniques, this was produced within about 2 hours of the process starting. And quite quickly, it was quite interesting that you can just use one plan to start to talk around different issues. So straight away, you can start to show people your town has got a very strong grid in the centre. You then quite quickly start to pull apart the council and say what on earth's been happening since 1960 onwards. But it was very interesting to see that you can start to sieve out these funny little developments as they move forward. They all start to get more wiggly, more disconnected. So just simply by filling in the houses and the streets and the blocks, you can start to articulate how the town had developed over time. The brief for this particular charrette was to use the council's corporate strategy, which was to develop 3 or 4 sites which highlighted the red lines around the town. And his brief in effect was to design these in detail to get people to get their views on it, how they should be shaped and how they looked. What he found quite quickly was that, I don't know if you can see from here, but this started to happen. And it goes to the crux of the planning process. When most local plans are prepared, many sites within that have been allocated and shaped without anyone designing a street or a block. So, first of all, he said, I simply can't do this. This is not possible. What we're saying, in fact, is that he's determining that each growth period didn't relate to the future, because all of the separate slices as they go through have never been designed. So how can you align streets and buildings and blocks to keep connecting maybe 5 or 10 years as they come through without this? So he said we can't work along this project, we have to the date 2060 was picked. This could be 2100 or 2200, doesn't really matter when. But the idea is that you can, if you design ultimately to start to pair a pattern, you need this long-term vision to be able to understand what it could look like. And as Sandy was saying as well, the purpose of this diagram wasn't necessarily to tell people that these streets and these blocks had to be created in this way, but the message was that you need to think much, much more holistically about how the town will grow. So again, we've got some of these ideas, catchments and trans-oriented development. So his pitch, in New Urbanism's pitch, is very much about trans-oriented development, which is backed up by transects and coding. So for the purposes of this, we're almost saying that this particular method of charretting is very much attached to New Urbanism, the principles of New Urbanism. So the question is how do we start to understand what all the techniques and principles and viewpoints can go behind this? Plans like this are great again, just very simple, very quick to prepare. But this whole idea, if we're talking about planning, we're talking about a particular place, he very, very clearly illustrated that all these particular lines not only met anywhere, so how on earth can I design the rest of this to connect in? So we want people to walk into the schools, walk into the town centre, the doctor's surgery. They've got a bit of a job because they've got to go all the way around whichever way to go. So we just discussed the idea that actions cause a lot of problems and public presentation, that all these homes need to be demolished. But he was just making the point that would have to happen for this type of planning to succeed. So again, it's just emphasising the fact that if you keep salami slicing planning over the long term, you'll never have the mechanism to connect everything together. And as I see what the presenters have touched on as well, it all revolved around this. None of those plans really got to the heart of the discussion. It wasn't until people got to a very local level, 90% of people don't understand 2D plans, photographs, that type of thing. If you start to show them their town square, where they sit, it starts to become a lot more relevant because they've sat there and that's a scale people can operate with. But importantly as well, the debate about whether to use CAD or graphics or what level of sophistication is interesting. It was interesting to hear what you were saying about paper being used as a vehicle. And this was great as well because if someone said, we'd quite like to see the building done this way, from this, it can be sent away, come back in an hour, have a cup of tea, and the issue's been resolved. So that person that was, to use one of Sandy's slides, shouting at the person or giving them difficulty has now been addressed and the problem has been issued. We've now moved on. So this quick, rapid technique allows people to resolve problems. Typically done by email or by letters, people are just corresponding. But if you can actually engage and show them. And this has started to get me thinking of actually what these are really important skill sets that need to be right front and centre, not just the planning, everyone's skill sets needs to be in here. And that was a phrase I picked out from the ministers who started to pick up some quotes from this. And it was this idea of positivity. It was none of this, please comment on it. Give us, what can we actually do to change it? So what I've looked at now is almost, if we talked about this idea of charrettes and design-led processes, we can talk about whether they're the same thing, or whether they're interchangeable, or they're just completely different. I've tried to think about how this principle of design-led approaches can start to come into normal practice. And this is why I went to the innovation slide. I have to teach myself how to present ideas to senior people as well to get some support for this. But what we're trying to understand is what special skills we need to engage. What I've gone to all the charrettes that are trying to happen in Scotland and observed the specialists and what are they actually doing? Is there anything different to what a normal planner would do? And what I've identified is that it's this idea of mediation is something that we're trying to do and understand, but not mediate to get an agreement, but mediate to actually capture it in a written or drawn form. And communicating only through design. We're not recording big sentences, it's only through design. And this idea about inspiring, this whole visioning process of narrative going all the way through, there is someone who's got hold of what they want to do and trying to guide people through it. Whether we believe it's actually their own view, or if the community is something different. The Design Skills Symposium in Air was fantastic because it was a demonstration of how participatory design can interface with a design process run by an expert. Perhaps the Charrettes are a bit different in that way. There's a view, and we're asking for opinions. So perhaps the question is how we evolve that technique. So I took 2 tests. Planning's got 2 systems, development planning and development management. People who make plans and people who make decisions, so I've got to test it on both. We looked at a process for moving on the charrette. So we've got the developers back in the room, part of the process. And we said we'd like to take it forward. They were very good. We've been working with them for 2 years, so we had some credibility that they could trust us to know that we wanted to move it forward. We weren't going to waste their fees and their time. So what I proposed, in fact, is a 4-stage process, which I think is quite similar to how the charrettes are run, but it was trying to say if we had a limited time, how would it work? So we had a week or 2 period where we all went away, and the officers and the council studied the place as well. So we needed to have a level playing field. Quite often you have proposals being presented, but people haven't been to site. So the officers were sent to site and they had to do their own analysis. The workshop happened 1 week later, and it was a day event. What we tried to do as well, what I've observed, is sometimes the wee bit of pressure cooker. People are all forced into positions on one day. So we said straight away, what we're going to do, we're going to come back next week and resolve the issues we can't resolve. So we're not going to try and resolve everything today. We want to try and get as far as we possibly can. This was separated by a week of reflection, where we managed to get the council to agree that we would commit to working hard in that week period to agree all the issues, so that when we come back to re-engage, we're not just giving you how to make a decision. So these are the types of diagrams and codings you see. It's the outputs like from a charrette. It's a similar principle. I started to draw some plans as well, but I just tested my theory in some ways. I tried to think about if we're trying to prove a concept, we actually need to demonstrate a difference. And I thought, well, actually this process typically takes 6 months to prepare supplementary planning guidance. It takes a long time. It took us 3 weeks to agree consensus with 3 separate landowners, which is, I thought, really good. It was quality driven. We hired an independent facilitator to help us through the process. So the council were on one side, the developer team were on the other. His only job was to make sure he was moving forward positively. He was almost neutral in that process. It was £2,000, and it focused a lot of energy on time. People weren't positioning themselves, they weren't articulating their sides better from something else. So I thought there was something really in this process. What I thought I'd then do is testing development management, which when we're doing the development planning side of things, we deal with it all the time. Development management is really time pressure, and the only measure really is speed. So let's have a look at that process. We had the proposal come in, and it wasn't going to be treated in the best possible way. It was just going to be refused. It was going to go to appeal, perhaps. So we're talking immediately, perhaps 32, 48 weeks, something like that. What we agreed to do was to have 4 2-hour workshops over the period of the termination process for this, which is typically 16 weeks. We agreed that at the end of that process, we would not change our view. This is our view. We had enough time to look at it. That should be enough. Between the discussions, we were able to reflect on this process. So again, this is just testing it with the developer who we've worked with before, so we just wanted to see whether they apply into this. So again, it's a principle of a design-led approach. It's not necessarily a charrette. This is the type of scheme that comes in. You can possibly see why it was going to be refused. But the key thing, which I tried to place myself in the role of that particular person, was that this case officer was fairly new out of university, had no design training, no drawing skills. He could almost express what he wanted to see change, but didn't quite have the language to be able to get into the conversation, to talk quality. So I was trying to think, you can't simply replace a planner with an urban designer all the way through. Is there 3 or 4 very simple things we could do? So I thought, if you want 4 pens and 4 layers of tracing paper, could the been a system we developed to do this. And just quite simply, the guy could actually just put a pen around all the blocks, and you quite simply see about 40% of them facing the backs of the gardens or facing onto either roads or spaces. So we're not happy with that. Also, I tried to illustrate with a red pen how someone would go around this development. They would keep going round and round and round probably, because they can't find a way out. And then we were using this idea of B-plan, which Sandy's team have piloted at Whole Moon. And again, through a Charrette or design-led technique, instead of the discussion being around, we don't quite feel the open space is in the right location, or we think it's not quite overlooked, you could just simply point to this area and say, what on earth is that? You know, what's this? There seems to be a lot of strangeness about this plan, but this allows you to get into that conversation. So what actually happened through this design-led process was that we managed to have a change all the way from this very traditional approach, which we see all the time coming through, to something that still has many, many issues to talk about, but it starts to look a bit like something that we would see through a design-led process. So the test, again, using this business model, it was approved, not refused. We got it through to committee, politicians liked it. It was quality-driven, it cost nothing. I do get paid something, but it cost the council just my time sitting in for 2-hour meetings, which is one day. And it was focused effort. So when we're looking at charrettes and other techniques, we have to think about actually when someone sat there on the other side of the room, there's a cost associated with that, either from fees or investment of their time. And they're thinking, perhaps, is there another site or another town we can invest elsewhere? So it's always trying to make sure that the balance of investment is always understanding what the private sector as well. So two examples, I can come back to them, just testing some of my own thinking at the moment as well on this. And we talked about what Kelly was a pilot, and we genuinely didn't really know how this process was going to play out at all. So lots of the thinking that's come from the mainstream program is excellent. It's something we wish we knew at the time as well, but we're learning as we're going. And delivery didn't really focus too heavily on this. It was more about trying to create a vision, but you know, through master planning and Symposium from a couple of weeks ago, if we're not clear upon delivery, who's going to take ownership, we're not really doing anything that effective. So what we commissioned a study, which came in a couple of weeks ago actually, and it's based upon an idea of sort of an urban extension in Malmo, and it was a typical urban extension document, but it didn't talk about housing demand or employment demand or anything like this. It simply had a diagram in front that said schools are going to be built here after this number of houses, can move into this development here. So instead of saying we're going to create this development, we don't know how much the roads are going to cost, the school, the years, the health centre, the social centre, the retail. We're actually starting to focus who's going to take ownership of this. So it's almost an agreed plan of how change is going to happen. So then we can suddenly start to focus on, okay, we've got to 2025, we've built out perhaps 400 houses, but there's no way planning gain from those houses is going to pay for that school. So is it better having a conversation now to start thinking about how the rest of that school is going to be funded? So what's this starting to do? For me, this is getting incredibly interesting, because those conversations you typically have within a council, between departments of education, between transportation, perhaps between housing services, you're actually showing them we would need to collaborate to get together. And the issue again is about focus on delivery. We moved on from actually thinking about design and a concept to actually getting about hard cash. But this is still very much from the Charrette process, which now into, I suppose, is the financial side. What I'll briefly mention as well is that the town team idea from Gerben is fantastic, and we sort of came a little bit late to that from Lockgelly because we didn't really understand how the process is going to play out. And there's two important points from this: is who runs a charrette? Is it the public or is it the private sector? What we found here is that almost 700 of the 800 comments was something to do with the town. Very, very little was actually said about how the street should be laid out, how the spaces should be laid out. So the mandate from the town to the politicians was actually to do something with the town centre and the town itself. So this has been set up, and it actually ties together all of the services in the council on a place. And it's unique in Fife. It's the only settlement that's got the structure. So all decisions, all sections of the council that have money to spend are negotiated and talked through in this particular way. Now, this is almost something about, perhaps Sam might come into later on, will. All of this happened because of sheer will. The politicians wanted it, and there's a fantastic officer called Hazel Cross, who is dedicated and wants to see things happen. And she really worked hard to make it all happen. It's nothing to do with that structure. It's got this person wanting to do things. So they've done all sorts of different things. They've done all sorts of shoplift, just to try and get a bit of confidence back in the town as well. But they've managed to do things like, I suppose moving on to the town centre agenda, how to support local shops and independents. So she managed to get 18 of 20 odd shops signed up to a discount scheme within the town centre as well. So this is all, it's all going forward brilliantly, and it's shortlisted for a regeneration award. But it's all down to this one officer, really, who's just kept at it for the last year or so. So it's demonstrated to me it doesn't really matter too much about the process, it's about the person who put in the process, which perhaps is something about the charrette as well. Who's up front, who's leading it. And lastly, what I'll just come on to is thinking about the third point, outcomes. If we're doing all of this, we're not creating a design for ourselves, we're actually trying to do three things about education, health and employment. Is any of this mattering? Is any of the design mattering? You might get a design award, but has that person's health improved? Have they got a better job? Have they got access to training? These are the key things. A slide it's from the improvement service, but it's from Harry Burns, Chief Medical Officer. And what he's pointing out is that if you put most of your money at the front end of early years provision of people's lives, you actually make a massive impact all the way through on jobs, on training, and on their health. So I'm starting to ask the question about priorities. How do you start to prioritise interventions into some of these areas? There's another driver as well. In the council, we get this every other week. And what it's telling us is that stop thinking about you're going to have everything. Everything's going to get less plentiful by a lot. The top is the demand for services. So these are the services people are actually wanting to see the council provide. The bottom figure is the actual money to do it. So we're in this very interesting sort of area where we're now being asked to focus on services. What does the council actually do? Does it actually do charrettes? Does it actually do design approaches? Does it just run schools and empty the bins? What does it do? There's a big discussion about that. There's a focus on assets. Everyone is understanding that if they're trying to rationalise their programme, whether it's the school estate, the NHS estate, employment land, anything, we're all trying to shrink. Now, if we're all doing that at the same time and shrinking, there's a real danger that everything can shrink in different directions. So the question is, who should be starting to intervene in this process, and what process should be looking at it? When it's this idea about place, there's an awful lot of chat talk about placemaking, but we're starting to get a narrative together that starts to bring a reason for placemaking. If we can really tie the charrette and design process into actually directing finances from across the council resources and the private sector into particular locations. This is what the government's trying to do anyway. Prevention, partnership, people, performance. It's all about charrettes, the language is there, it's about design, it's about collaboration. Something about prevention. Shall I get the last slide? So, my own test, it's my own validation for you to critique as much as anything else. These processes, I think, are faster, there's no doubt about it. Design-led, form-based approaches enable collaborative processes. That's critical. Design-led, form-based. The output of the planning system is something built. It's not something we talk about. It's something that goes in a certain location. It has to be designed at some point, so why not start right at the beginning? It's better because it enables deeper and simultaneous exploration of complex issues. I can't think of any other process I've witnessed since working with an authority where all the issues around a specific set point have come together. So the charrette gives you a mechanism to think about everything, but focusing it on a place. It's cheaper, more accurate planning rates, more certainty. So that's something about investment. It's much clearer for investors why they should be doing something in a certain location. And we're trying to think now about more. We're not thinking about building health centres, we're thinking about closing them and putting them 4 into 1 somewhere else. So this idea about the scaling of charrettes is critical because we're actually trying to decide how communities function. Does the person who used to have a conversation in the doctor's surgery in the local town now need to get on a bus to go to the next location? How does that impact their lifestyle if they're already deprived or low income? Is that things going to tip them over the edge? Now we talk about this convenience. Sandy was outlining the complexity of government and local authority. Trying to get the key decision makers into one place is proverbial herding cats. So you're almost trying to invent a mechanism whereby you're making it the vested interest of how those people in that room, because this is the most important meeting they're going to go to this year in this particular development. So it's always trying to get the idea that this is the place to make a decision. It's not an add-on, it's actually the decision-making process. So it's almost a pitch to say that charrettes are great design's the narrative, but let's make it really embedded in the system. So that's why my Dragon's Den pitch route to say it works. Thank you very much.
Now, I will invite the banner to come this way, if you don't mind. I will ask Barbara and Hina as well to come as well to the banner. By the end of your questions, we will have 5 or 6 questions. My colleague Sam as well from Architecture Design Scotland, he will give a summary for your questions and for your answers as well. And then by the end, we will put up the answers of the audience and as well one slide reflections summarize all your inquiries, concerns and questions. Okay, David.
That's a terrific set of presentations. I'm grateful for them, and I'm particularly grateful to David Thompson for taking us beyond charrettes. You mentioned that skills required for actually the charrette process, David's mediate, communicate, inspire, and then you drew us onward into place-based management. And I noticed Keith Winter showed up as the big man, who's the director of development, in fact, as the big man in the project board. But would you want to say something more about the middle range skills required for managing the post-charrette process, the delivery process? Are they mediate, communicate, inspire, or are there certain additional skills required? Tough, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. What I try to do, that's what I think it's got to. So that particular person who is running all the post-charrette work now is someone who is a fantastic communicator, and they can mediate it, but they've never lost sight of this narrative. But they're not necessarily a designer. So I've had about 3% input post of that, because most of it's to do with very, very soft skills of getting people connecting. And it's almost where I observed from the calendar charrette is that happens in power of seeing the politician and then a 14-year-old do the final presentation and take ownership on. So almost deliberately, what has to happen next is very much down to the community. What Gelly's growth from the charrette is now enshrined with planning guidance. So it's a very difficult one because the management of that is now waiting for them to come forward with proposals. It's all tied into land values, possession, mortgage market, etc. So there's lots of dynamics out of the process that I think we could have explained a lot earlier within it. But I think the inspiration now has transferred to the community, and that's why it's been picked up by Surf, who picked it up shortlisted for an award, because it wasn't the officers doing any presenting around the community. All the community presentations and actions, they were doing their own work. So the judges found that they were passionate about their particular place. So even though there might have been someone on the council who done this or not done that, the ownership had transferred clearly, and that was all from that particular charrette, which was a whole town approach. It had to happen, because it wasn't really about growth and development of the town centre. It was about trying to get people's confidence enough to go into perhaps open up a few retail units or do something on public realm. But I'd still say that the media communicating inspire is sort of an idea of just testing, I suppose. But I don't know what the analysts think. Drawing everyone else in.
Oh, I thought I might wait for another question and maybe come back to that, so that unless someone else wants to go on.
The only thing that strikes me from what David was saying is the whole issue about what skills the community themselves might need to take the agenda forward, and perhaps they also need additional support and help, because there are going to be issues about how to develop projects, how to keep the community together, project management kind of issues. And I don't know whether any thought's been given to supporting the community.
I can answer that question. So that was the short-term project law was set up to allow the community and the people who invested locally, whether it's the Housing Association, to have a voice and start to coordinate it. But all the time, the vision in the background was the Charrette proposal. So every time there was discussion, we had the adopted planning guidance sat at the table to show how those sites that had been designed at the Charrette could be taken forward. So all those principles were there. So there was what is created now is a central narrative, and things are starting to happen inside of it. But the broad idea of redeveloping the town centre and securing it is happening, and it's slowly evolving in different directions. It's always learned to be quite comfortable with that idea, but the master planning process, we can't really plan in that certainty. We plan a few principles.
I suppose I was particularly interested in the responsiveness of the local authority, because I've seen many community initiatives which become frustrated with the fragmentation of local authority responsiveness to roads and all the other departments. Maybe I'm talking too much, but I thought some of your streamlined processes suggested bringing officer group, and on occasion officer group with developer together to thrash out issues on a more comprehensive rather than single function basis.
I think that this is starting to be recognised, because the politicians in Fife are starting to ask how do we solve whole town problems. And only in the last couple of weeks, reports are coming out saying they're looking for how a whole town initiative is principally driven by a town centres approach as well. But the principles still apply. But now perhaps the people who are in the game are perhaps something different. So who is making the strategic decisions for that town? It could be the planning authority from Edinburgh, it could be someone else. So the same issues are there. And this is why I was interested in debate about this whole idea of place briefing, which we tried at the Symposium. It gives people an idea to understand what is actually the thing we need to focus on. And then is it a charrette? Is it the thing Susan was talking about? There's a whole range of things that can be deployed to achieve what we want to capture, but have we actually set out the process well enough to understand who needs to be at the table?
I think that's a really good point though, because what happens at the Charrette and is useful is that you've got public authorities there and they have to revert to each other. So you've got somebody who's charged with green space, has to speak to somebody about roads and look at the eye and say, you can't do that because of this. They've got to work that out there. at the Charrette. And that's the idea. But I don't think that continues back in local authorities. I think they probably say, but that's over, you know, just squeak through it. But I think it's really important that it should be, you know, it should be project teams that persist long beyond the Charrette itself. So people are charged with taking forward the project, the vision, and delivering it, not in signing off on their planning consent or purifying this or that. I just we've got it done. It's on site. It's happening. Etc.
I think this is relevant. I'm just reflecting on the outcomes of the old Hatfield Charrette. That they're so well grounded in sort of principles of urbanism and in a really transparent sort of community engagement process. So the community was very much involved in the development of the proposals that came out of the Charrette. So, you know, it couldn't be argued that this was just something that a designer came in and decided to do. So, you know, it has legitimacy in a community sense. It has a legitimacy in a design sense. And so when they're now going for planning consent for specific elements of those proposals, they're in a very strong position in dealing with local authority to say, you know, this ought to get consent because it's kind of met these tests. So that, you know, I think that's sort of the backdrop. And one of the things I've noticed also arising from the old Hatfield Charrette and the work I'm involved in now with stakeholders and partners in relation to the station and its relationship to the old town and the new town is that the Highways Authority are doing really interesting and kind of like very kind of modern transport planning work to try to tame what was effectively a highway and turn it into more of a place, turn it into a boulevard, that section of the road, so that it will no longer make a kind of severance between the two sides of the town. And you know, so they're using, again, incredibly good urban design principles, but ones which are not mainstream to a lot of transport, you know, to highways planning. And I think that is a fascinating sort of shift, and I think it's interesting that it's coming from the traffic engineers in the sense of signed up, you know, because of the sort of excellence, if you like, of a Charrette-based process, which has helped, I think, sort of literally shift the ground, and people's thinking about how to make places that really are livable for people. So, you know, I do see some, you know, fascinating moves coming from both the kind of town stakeholders and from a kind of local authority, in this case a regional sort of county level authority on the other side, finding sort of common ground, literally.
So there's probably one point to pick up on, just quickly on the process of going back into the authority. One of the things that is very difficult for authorities to understand the Charrette and the meeting process and seeing benefits. What Sandy's described is exactly the output that should happen. Single issues that have previously dealt as single issues are then seen as shared issues, so the other officers understand where each other's going from, so you can start to have at least a basis of a consensus. What we've now managed to get through in Fife is that the management have understood this, and we've got possibly the first design studio set up. The principal reason to be that we need to have a collaborative approach to getting people around it. We're still working on the operating mandate of it. It's just a room with a smart board, but calling it a design studio and having some nice tables and, you know, nice windows gives it a difference. And it's called that, book it out. So the idea is there now, the room's built. So we're trying to get as many people into that room to say this is how we started to work it through. And it's simple. I really think it's simple, and I really think that a couple of key things can change a lot of practice in Scotland on that. It was just an example of how that one or two little changes and subtle changes, just allowing people to talk. And I think I totally agree with what Sandy's doing. A very simple change will allow it to happen.
Yeah, he's taking ownership.
Can I pick up on the theme from the last question, but also something Barbara said? I think one of the keys is that the Charrette process and the people involved need to be empowered to make decisions and make things happen. And the frustration of getting into the discussions, good ideas come up, and you know you have to go back to the authority to get clearance, or perhaps it's Transport Scotland, and involves Transport Scotland, that's at least 2 years to get a decision. But
the decision-making processes aren't quick enough because of bureaucracy. But the other thing that worries me is getting the right people involved and getting the public involved. I can understand in Lochgelly, an area which has problems, getting the people involved in that process, but in, say, Highland Perthshire, or largely around Perthshire, we are stuck with the affluent end of the community, probably incomers who will participate, and getting the locals who know more about the needs of an area involved is really difficult. And moving on to Barbara's issue, it's about empowering communities, and doing that we need to educate the communities. And we've got this new community empowerment bill going through Scottish Parliament at the moment. There doesn't seem to be this commitment to the education process. Most people come out of school in this country not knowing how local government, central government works and how to interact with it. And I think we've really got to do an awful lot to empower communities if these processes are going to work.
Any reflection?
The key question, I suppose, is what do they want to show it for? And it's in previous presentations, that's been the starting point. And it's sometimes you'll hear the approach, we want to Charrette, and we hear a number of what do you want to do? What do you want to achieve from that? There can be many other reasons for it. So the inertia of those communities might be feeling is that, well, we're quite happy with what we've got at the moment. So the proposition for them to come and get involved is not made yet. So there's nothing perhaps significant impacting their lives. So it's always, all the Charrettes are very, very different. People can comment now, but the Lochgelly one was very much about how on earth does a whole town come together, grow over the long term. So straight away, the proposition has every single person in that community should be having a say in it, and they can see a reason why they get involved. If it's about a public ground or a square or something smaller, it perhaps might not engage everyone as well. You know, I'm interested in that best interest approach. How do you start to define stakeholder groups and set up a program?
I can see there's more questions waiting, so I'll just say very briefly. In the Charrette techniques I teach at university and that have been used more in the States, but also have been used a bit here, we teach people to do very considerable stakeholder mapping, kind of identifying kind of primary and secondary stakeholders, if you like, making sure that the showstoppers get dealt with, that the people who block the project are kind of involved early. You know, that you don't start doing the actual intensive design workshop until you've done a considerable amount of baseline research, mapping, engagement, so processes so that people are primed to be involved. And as you say, you sort of education and debate as you go through. It's an iterative process. You know, there's dialogue and there's learning, mutual learning, I guess. So in some Charrette teaching of Charrette techniques, there's a lot of emphasis on that pre-Charrette phase, and it's incredibly important, so that you don't get a situation where people come along, you know, and miss issues, that baseline information about plans of the Highway Authority, or you know, plans that are already in train, you know, who don't know what's going on. You've got to have all that stuff sorted before you even start. Yes, yes.
Yeah, what I understood is like Charrette is a potential that it educates through engagement. So it's engage, educate, and then empower people, community. So that way people start taking the ownership, and then they build trust.
Shall I invite a reflection from the audience? This kind of reflection picks up on the point here, I also used to come up at the beginning. I can't say I'm retired now, but previous 20 odd years, it's not switched on when needed. It is one I can argue others are pioneers in these techniques, there's no doubt about it, that they are very effective in promoting the kind of dialogue and understanding. But I think the key issue, and I see home to me is the very low level of understanding and appreciation of much of what's been talked about today. My religion says, you know, how can design help make your life better? I mean, I think people really like it. So that's where processes work, how processes work. And I think where the investment needs to be made is actually in, first of all, developing an understanding and appreciation of what the issues are. If they use a word that people have about the problems of this place, there's several things I know about professional life, and what people really have is having where they live, defined by its problems. But inevitably there are problems, but I mean, getting people to understand where they are, what the problems are. And I think otherwise you get into a situation where you try to provide answers to questions that people actually never ask. So I think the investment is how to get people to rightly answer the right questions about where they live, and then use these processes to find solutions. But I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I will invite Professor Mark Dicken from Edinburgh University, an expert in sustainable community, to ask a question, please.
Thank you for that introduction. Sorry, there's very interesting talks, a lot of common themes coming around, so I'll just try to make some general observations and then maybe possibly cause a question to the panel. I mean, the presentations of Charrette is a difficult concept, I feel, particularly when you're trying to connect it to a community. And I think that there is a disconnect there, and because of disconnect, much of what was said today about the actual form and the content and the subject of the actual action and the technique which is used, which is a charrette, not carrying the content of the community with it. But as a consequence, it seems a very horizontal action to me. And I think those are some of the observations that you were also making, in the sense that you would say, well, let's scale it up, you know, let's get a vertical to this, and therefore let's network the thing. Let's see it as part of a network which is both horizontal and vertical, and therefore we can see it as an integrated action. It isn't coming across that way at all at the moment. It's coming across very flat, and it's coming across as a very front-of-shop exercise, and possibly therefore a little bit of window dressing, and all the other criticisms that we trace back to participation, you know, in the mid to late 1960s. And this is another thing that irks me quite a lot about the charrette. It's been imported via the French vocabulary alongside America and somehow into Europe as a way of also sort of overcoming everything that's been learned in community planning from 1960 onwards. And that, again, I think you're calling out for this actual reintegration back into the subject of community planning via this particular charrette, but seem to have no, as you said, codes or principles upon which to stand, and just, you know, learning by action, which is fabulous, intervention, etc., or learning by doing, structuralist techniques, and that of that type. But many of the critical insights you've made have already been codified, you know, and they've all been written up and disseminated widely and mainstreamed. And most of them come, in my experience, from the last experience of such interventions, which are a public realm face, and to do with building communities or making communities much more resilient and sustainable, which comes from the last round of urban regeneration projects, and particularly the Scottish round in particular, which obviously, you know, may now not be in political forefront. But I feel there's a whole legacy and wealth of other assets intellectually you could draw upon to really push this particular technique to the fore where you want it to be, and give it almost like that integrated manufacturing approach, whereby we're not just talking about visions anymore, and we're not talking about image, we're not talking about symbol, we're talking about something real and transformative, and which will, you know, step up and be a step change. And the diagnostic stage, which you again are sort of making great play on, but linking the vision back to the program and the results base, and the thing that really is absolutely key to getting some on-site ground transformation and a modification or improvement to topology of mind. That was a bit of a rant, I apologize for that. But you inspired me so much to put all these ideas together. So I wondered if you could help me out to some degree by letting me know whether you shared any of those particular comments which I've made over the past couple of minutes.
I think it's a very productive rant. I don't think it's a rant at all. I could always ask a question back and say, techniques are there, yeah. Not claiming to be doing anything new or pioneering, it's just trying to learn from others. I think that's almost a Scottish context, trying to share and learn from each other, not trying to have an architecture step up or work from each other. So the question back would almost be, what if we know things work and it's being disseminated, what do you think are the barriers that have stopped it happening so far?
The barriers to a large degree, I think, are semantic, and as the court was before, perhaps we reach too far ahead of ourselves, and try and grasp the air rather than stand on something quite firm, and almost trying to run too quick too, and not carrying the weight of the exercise with us in the process. So it's this, balance, the sort of more critical approach, I would say, in terms of, as you say, reflecting back upon the actual steps that we're trying to make. I mean, I disseminate this, under the notion of a stepwise logic, so that we're going beyond information, we're going beyond knowledge, we're actually wisdom, and we can draw upon experiential learning of the past, and actually start to build and construct step by step a knowledge of what action should be taken in that regard. So I think definitely we need a pedagogy, yes, a very strong pedagogy to underpin this. And that debate has not really surfaced with the, shall we say, clarity and discipline and surgical precision that's required to know exactly what we're doing. And know what's actually driving us forward in this regard. And know that we're not just, performing some charade and it's just part of the game and it's all that. And therefore we should invest in these things and make them quite real.
Just one point on this couple of comments. The one thing I observe is that what I try to understand about skills is that there's very few people with my skill sets who are designers or professional designers in the public sector. I'm counting less than 10. There's almost 900 planners. So what we're starting to identify and question ourselves is how do we set up these mechanisms? And part of my challenge is, has it failed to take off because there isn't really a receiver to run these processes? And I'm trying to demonstrate that there's effective ways of doing this in multiple locations within the system that delivers investment in terms worth things going in this process. So let's just
I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff in what you're saying. I guess a couple of reflections on that. There needs to be, I think, a lot more work done to kind of critique the whole notion of charrette from a sort of academic point of view, but also it's kind of an applied process. From my point of view, the charrettes I've worked on have been very grounded in kind of thinking about sort of people's understanding of their place and relating to kind of long-term knowledge about what has shaped those places over time, the kind of morphology of the place and the sort of the social processes, the economics, what's gone on in terms of their resilience or lack of it. So they haven't felt like window dressing or kind of just a very surface treatment. I guess what I've liked about charrettes is that although I worked, before working in academia, I worked as in community engagement for many years and ran lots of processes. And they were, the processes are often very good, but design was missing. Whereas the thing about charrettes is that it comes from kind of understanding the kind of principles of design that really do shape our places, whether we realise them or not, and the decisions we make about, about street patterns and block structures. Streets, the roads in particular, can stay in the landscape for thousands of years. They are fundamental decisions that are very difficult to shift once they're in. And I think the point in Montpellier, they showed, these are the houses you have to go down to re-knit back those bits of dendritic areas that don't work, really show very clearly that once you put those things in, they're incredibly hard, and you know, to deal with afterwards. How do you get a community to agree that we're going to knock down all these houses in order to kind of make, you know, to get connectivity back? So, one further thought, that the Hertfordshire Charrette, which was sort of a guide to growth, reflected deeply on the sort of morphology, the history of the county in its settlement patterns over hundreds of, not thousands of years. So I felt that it was very grounded in kind of long-term thinking about the place and then the implications for settlement resilience and sustainability in the future. And, you know, in a really kind of sustainable communities kind of paradigm, if you like. Somebody has to reference Thomas Kuhn at some point during every session. Anyway, so, but I do take your point about, you know, it kind of important, if you like, the notion of the charrette. And I think it's sort of something we need to reflect on and think about more.
I would like to ask Eric from Architecture Design Scotland as well.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I quite like to pick up on something that was raised at the Master Plan Symposium, but I think it also applies here. And Professor Brian Evans said that places we love are rarely the product of singular or linear processes. And there was a discussion then, as I think there has been a discussion today, around the idea of problem solving, about providing specific solutions. Almost providing a kind of a clean approach. Here's an answer, we can draw it, there are diagrams, there are walk patterns, there are streets. But a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks back, there was also this acceptance of the need for messiness, the need for people things, the need for complexity, the need for kind of unresolved elements, and also the understanding that it's not always about physical interventions. You need to have interventions that enable either economic or social things, small incremental change emerging over time appropriate to the local sets of circumstances. It's been a long way of introducing an idea of a question. I'd like to try and relate that side to the notion of how are these things commissioned? Because presumably if somebody commissions them, if it's a local authority, they're commissioning it for a reason. If it's a landowner, commissioning it for a reason. They're not commissioning it because they want to have complexity and messiness and evolutionary emergent incremental change over time. They want to have things happen. They want to see drawings, they want to see results, they want to see time scales for action. And actually some places, in some sets of circumstances, that isn't always necessarily the answer. And I think that was maybe coming out in 1 or 2 of the questions from the floor. I think it's tying back into some of the things that came through from the Master Plan Symposium. And so I think it came through from a chat that I had earlier about how do you commission these things? What are you going to get at the end of them? And what are the actions? And if they are to be meaningful in that sense, then you need to stitch in very critically to a timetable for action. Because if you're going to influence the planning process, you have a very small window to do that. Minister's report, and that's it. You know, time you're in for the next 4 or 5 year cycle. So, I'm not talking about a planning system, I'm not talking about a landowner, I'm talking about, this is all about collaborating with people to allow people to live their lives. It's not about producing nice plans with ground blocks and street patterns. It's about allowing people to live their lives. So I suppose, kind of a mix of observations, a bit of a challenge, a bit of a pulling forward from the previous event, and not a question inside.
One quick reflection, if you don't mind. Just one reflection.
Quickly, then, the next phase of what we're doing with Charrettes is looking at the conditions report stage. And that's because, why commission a Charrette at that stage? Because it's a crucial point, and it doesn't happen. People don't get involved in conditions reports. Big stakeholders do, you get Transport Scotland, etc. But what will happen is in 5 years' time, the plan's adopted, and somebody says, where did that Tesco come from? You know, or there's an application for a Tesco across the road. We're not having that. It's in the plan. It's in the plan already. You can't really object. You can object, but guys, you missed the boat. So what we're looking at now, and this doesn't involve increasing the scale of it, is looking at how can the main issues report involve a Charrette, so that actually you start to harness some of that knowledge. You won't capture all, and it's only one sort of potential tool in the box too. You know, this is not competitive about Charrettes versus, you know, inquiry by design or any other methodology. You know, it's one area, and for me, anything which captures some knowledge and makes a more informed decision is a benefit. Let's be doing it. I don't, you know, until public servants, we should be out there until we're blue faced doing this stuff.
So, what you said just brought me to say one small big thing, which was, I thought it was all great, so please don't get me wrong. But one almost inspiring moment was when you talked about government and the idea that, you know, in their place they're sitting down and talking about credit union, because that's what they have to do. It's not about public development improvements, it's not about an Aldi on the edge of town, it's about a credit union, because there's something in that that is appropriate and authentic to their set of circumstances, that kind of builds on the legacy of who they are as a community where they want to go in the future.
Absolutely, and that links to the co-production.
And that doesn't come about through physical change or plan making, but it almost is it, but no less important.
Yeah, and the point is that you allow the community to come forward and say, this is what's important, these are the things, and this is how we want to deal with it, and then you enable them to do that. As opposed to you go in, you analyse things, you say, now we've got a programme for you guys, we've got a programme for you, you know, to be part of it. So it's co-production model, I think, of the law.
Can I just say,
just one second, Barbara.
That just made me think about, you were asking who commissions it, and you asked was it the local authority, was it the developer? Maybe it should be the community. Because, you know, in terms of actually them taking ownership of their plan, and okay, linking into nation support, but people don't think in terms of, you know, silos. They do think right across all aspects of their lives, and that kind of plan is what we want.
But then there are issues about that. It worked in Calendar because of the Calendar organisation, but they were constituted a very articulate, middle class, aspirational. It's not really not always those kind of communities that need to be constituting themselves in order to get this sort of.
Could I just comment? I think it's important to say that design and sort of process-based changes are not either or. And I think Charrettes have got capacity to encompass both the kind of process things that come out of the discussion and design changes, which, you know, for me, making it take 5 minutes to walk to the shops, not 10 minutes in the same space, has a profound effect on people's quality of life. You know, having height-to-width ratios that work to make kind of comfortable outdoor rooms has profound effects on livability. So, you know, of course, I'm very interested in spatiality, so I do see it as important, but I don't think I wouldn't claim it's the only thing that's going on. But I don't think we should underplay the results that can have in terms of livability for people. The other point about who commissions charrettes, I think it's intriguing to see how many charrettes have been commissioned by landowners who are, there's been a number of sort of aristocrats who own significant land holdings who commission charrettes, who, ironically, because they own land over, their families do over a very long time frame, are perhaps less interested in the kind of, you know, what's going to happen in the next year, 2 to 3 years. They might be thinking in 200, 300, 400 year time frames about building a social capital and kind of their place that their family is an interest in. And so, you know, again, it's kind of paradoxical if you like, but they may actually be quite civilised charrette commissioners in that sense, because they're not wanting to just get a quick buck out of a land holding and you know, extract as much value from the land very quickly. And I think, you know, so that's an intriguing aspect of charrette commissioning, I think, in the UK.
Maybe it lost well, follow up on this ownership thing, because that was another question is in my mind, is who actually proposes, who takes ownership? I'm supposed to be pressing something. It is on. Just you've got to very close to you. Thank you for feedback. Yeah, who actually promotes, who actually takes ownership of these things? I can put in a plug for an exercise that we specified. A small group of us got together, got a small amount of money, only £1,500, appointed a consultant who facilitated exercises which gave every household in the area, like hamlets and properties, the opportunity to say what was good, what was bad about where they were living, and what were their biggest concerns. And out of that, we helped us create an action plan which has 5 themes to it. And now the themes have actually attracted people who are interested in the issue of affordable housing. So we've got a situation where at community council, if somebody, the planning secretary reads out there's a planning application for 12 houses down there. 3 or 4 years ago, this would be met with, we don't want those. So let's say meeting, some people say, I think the post office is going to close. And then people start making connections. Well, the school roll is falling. And so in a very simple way, not, financial resources necessarily were relatively modest, and actually started a debate going. People now, because some of the answers to the questions we were asked were, well, it's in the local plan. What local plan? People actually are beginning to understand that. And now if you come to community councils and a planning application, because of an exercise that others did, which actually brought people round the village and other areas, and actually pointed out, what gave the place its character and something, people actually made much better, more informed comments for a planning application. There was one which was a site on one of the roads into the village, and somebody actually said this is an important gateway into our village. We should be concerned about continuity of frontage. So I think it's actually possible to get that kind of discussion going, but it's really grassroots stuff. That's what I said earlier. People have actually got to understand the issues and start making the demands, and then we can follow up with the kind of processes that have been described today. It starts in individual communities.
Thanks. Now, I think the time for closing down. I would like to invite Sam for the final reflection and points. And we would like as well to finally to put some slides, which is the audience. Yes, see. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi there. I'm Sam Castle. As I'm listening to what's going on today, one thing I did reflect on, I'm involved in a lot of what the exciting people call place-based reviews. And most authorities in Scotland are doing that just now. The people who are doing it are chief executives and financial directors. And so far, I haven't been to one with a planner. I haven't been to one with people who do this great work, who come from this background. And often those authorities, I've got to tell them that while we're having a place-based review, next door almost, there's a master planning charrette for the same place. And round the corner there's a community empowerment event taking place. So I think it's important that we see this process in the context of a whole bunch of processes that are taking place. But the heart of it is a good news story. The heart of it is, for whatever reason, collaboration's in. Collaboration's in. Autocratic, single-sided decision-making is definitely out. And people in local authorities or people in silent agencies who think it's not are already getting a salutary, lesson from the powers that be. So that central role of collaboration is there. Kind of won that argument in terms of decision-making at a government agency level. The issue is, how the hell do we do it? And how is that reflection occurred? There's one key question which I took away from, there's a whole bunch of key questions. There's one, for me, one actually central question which I would put at the heart of this. And that's, what makes a charrette authentic? What makes a charrette authentic? One of the slides, maybe one of yours actually, I can't remember now, it was one of yours, that was it. And it had the facilitator, the adjective in front of the facilitator's name was world-renowned. I have never had an equal conversation with a world-renowned anybody. You know? So, oh, this is the world-renowned. We'd like to have a chat with them. Not really. I'd like to have a conversation with an amateur, thank you, who really cares about what my life. So there's an issue there about just how people see authenticity. So that's the one I'd like to kind of put at the heart. And if I've got 2 minutes at the end, I'd like to throw it back to the audience if I may as well, just before we shut down. Okay, so that's the heart of my observation. When Barbara was talking about the last session, I'm sorry I missed that, because I just couldn't make it. What I took away from that summary were a real concern about what the drivers are. What are the drivers for change? What are the drivers for having a Charrette at all, for God's sake? Is it because central government says we've got to have them? Is it because they're really useful? Is it because it's really fair? Because there's a kind of split reasoning here in support of Charrettes. One is, it's a much fairer way of doing stuff. We should talk to folk on the ground because we'll get better communities. The other one is, it's damn fast, doesn't cost very much, and we can get away with the stuff that results afterwards usually. And we kind of mix them up depending who we're talking to. So I think that kind of rigor thing needs to be very clear, you know, what the motive is behind it. And I kind of go with both. I think I have to be very clear in a given context what the driver is for actually having such an event. And from those events, what are the drivers, the real drivers for action? Not just, you know, okay, here's the charrette, that was wonderful, these are the conclusions, try and do an A3 document, bind it nicely, have really nice drawings. Yeah, but what will drive action? Not just do we have good actions, good recommendations in the doc, what actually do we have? So that's the first thing for me, is that whole thing about what are the drivers here. Sandy was talking, I'll steal some of your graphics, so there's copyright, those graphics, I will steal those, thank you. And your explanation is very self-explanatory, but a bit that really struck me was that whole hangovers thing. Because the hangovers is not just a kind of a sand in the machine. How we deal with the hangovers will determine whether the machine is worthwhile at all. You know, so the issue of hangovers, the issue of how we actually proceed forward from a charrette or an engagement or an encounter, whatever, it doesn't matter what we call it, to be honest. What we do with that co-production model seems to me the whole gig. We could describe an absolutely stunning charrette, and if every stunning charrette leads to a hangover of emigration, they're not stunning charrettes. So maybe in a way, the gig for the process is okay. We've kind of got that. We're doing all right in that stuff. There's lots of good experience out there. There's tons of work to build on, both here and abroad. So we kind of got that. We know we haven't solved it, but we know what the problems are. But it struck me listening, we haven't really solved the problems of the hangovers. And the hangovers are going to be absolutely central to whether anybody can bother doing this down the line. So the hangover seems to be where we perhaps need to put a lot more of our focus. I was listening to Yashar will be getting on this. Susan, is that right? Thank you, sorry. There were two things that struck me. The main one would be the need for a palette. There's that recognition that we do stuff. We have a whole range of ways of doing stuff. And it's almost, I think it's not very helpful to define charrette. I think it's quite helpful to have this kind of slightly vague term, which you define as, well, it was really just a kind of slightly pretentious term we used to charge fees. But it basically means we've got a bunch of folk together in the room, and the way I do it's this way, the way he does it's slightly different. So as a term, I'm not too bothered. You know, someone asked me to do one on the borders recently called, said, can you come and do a squeeze? I had no idea what a squeeze is. Eric does, so he told me what a squeeze was, which is useful. But as long as we can get together for a gig and kind of sort stuff out with certain values and principles at the heart of it, and a certain motive with a certain intent, I'm kind of comfortable. Call it what you will. But can we do it, please? Can we kind of get on with this? So that recognition that the term charrette or process fits within a whole palette of ways of encountering, and the fact that if we go abroad or if we go into a different community, it will be a different thing. Your gig, apart from being drunk, seemed different in Transylvania. You know, Yes, and trying to fit that into the fee proposal would be a really interesting one. So much plum brandy in charge fees, just plum brandy. Fair enough. But also it did raise, as a side issue, the whole cultural thing struck me as well. There was a lot of talk in passing by people about the right type of facilitator, the right type of person. And there is a problem there, or sorry, not a problem, there is a challenge really. Is it better to have someone who is outside the community or the culture or the place, who can bring some kind of independent, experienced eye to it from many places? Or is it better to have someone who has strong links or has a place in the community? And I haven't got an answer for that one, by the way. But I think it needs to be a question we ask every time we bring somebody in. It's not just the right skills. I don't think there are generic facilitating skills for charrettes, which you can always apply everywhere, whether you're world-renowned or not. I think we need to always think, in this place, at this time, in this context, what's the right type of facilitator for this? How skilled do we need to be, or how amateur do we need to be? So, palette seemed to be the next one. You set out the process really clearly, Dave. And I'll steal some of those, but probably have less words on them. You know, I kind of got the process. But I think that need to continue the process, to see the charrette process in the context of a much wider, longer process, is what, like, certainly I'd hold my hands up to kind of slipping, ducking and diving around that, just passing the difficult baton on to other people. So we seem to be getting better at setting up the charrette process, and then just turning the page and it says, thank you. You know, that charrette process needs to fit into a longer scale one, both before and after. I think that way that relates back to the hangover issue. You know, the process of what we do after a charrette seems to me as important as the process that sets up the charrette. It's never a generic thing, but we need to have a Scooby where we're going with it. And that sense of put at the heart of it, not seeking answers, but seeking questions. Because that is the fundamental. Answers are easy. I've always reckoned the best opening question for any event is joy from friends, which is how you doing? Because it allows people to kind of fill that space with what's in their mind at that point in time. But the minute you shape the questions to provide you with certain types of answers, you're kind of doomed. And if I say to you, I'm an urbanist, I'm actually not, but I'm an urbanist, and I'm here from Artists in Scotland with Artificial Place Division, I'm going to ask you some open questions. You're thinking, what the hell do I know about buildings? You know? And I better give them answers that are relevant to buildings, otherwise they won't really respond to me. So I think we have to be very careful how we prompt the right questions. Not ask the right questions, but prompt the right questions so we can actually respond to those. The panel discussion, there were two things, but I think I'll try and put them into one, just so he's got a nice easy list, and which is about capacity. I mean capacity. Capacity is a word I'd forgotten about until I came back to the public sector. When I'd say, well, I meant so-and-so, but he's crap. No, I just can't say that, Sam. He's got a capacity issue. Or I'd say, this planning process just doesn't work. No, it does work, but we haven't got the capacity to kind of deal with it. And so capacity kept on coming up time and time again. And so it also comes up in terms of not just resource capacity or skill capacity or knowledge capacity or time and resource, but it also comes up in terms of motives. Like almost, it's a very pretentious term, but choose kind of ethical capacity. How broad is this? Are we always bringing to bear a wide range of skills, knowledge, resources, contacts, power base, but also a wide range of concerns and issues, and a wide range of empathy? Can you have that? A lot of empathy. You can have a lot of empathy. So I think there are big capacity issues in terms of what we think we're capable of. There is something incredibly arrogant in doing what I'm doing just now. So I just listened to you all, thank you. And I've summarised this, and we'll do a slide soon about this, and a programme. You know, and so that I need a capacity to say I'm probably wrong, and you need the capacity to say, he is wrong, we're going to do something about it, because we know where he lives. You know, so that I think is something that we need to take very seriously going, if we're going to roll this out more, And the point I said at the beginning is we're already rolling this out more. We're just not calling it charrettes or squeezes. We're calling it asset reviews or something. But it's happening as we speak. It's in my diary. I know financial directors wait until their budgets till they've finished doing these kind of things. So we need to get very quick at catching up about A, being part of that process, which often we're not, and B, dealing with its consequences, having the capacity amongst ourselves. So that was 6 words. Authenticity, key question. What makes a Charrette authentic? What are the real drivers, both ethical and practical? What the hell are we going to do about the hangovers? It seems to be an absolutely massive issue, particularly in these times. Do we really understand the full palette so we're not trapped? We might think charrettes are useless, fair enough, let's do a workshop, or let's do the squeeze, my new best product. Do we fit this into the longer process to really understand it without handcuffing yourselves? And let's be honest about the capacity. You just don't know what we're doing here, or that person doesn't understand, and not give people tasks, or give ourselves tasks we're not really skilled enough to deal with. Can I ask them one question then, just before we go?
Just only one.
Just, oh, I've got a slide.
Because we've got quickly summary as well.
Oh, well, in that case, let's move on to the summary. Thank you very much indeed.
This is just very, very quickly, and I'm very grateful to Maggie and Kay, actually. They've done a lovely job. This is the outcomes of your, how can I say, 2 questions, the outcome of your questions. First of all, to do with engagement. Of course, we will share this slide with all of you, but interestingly, clarity, features, analysis, happy public, interesting, respect, trust. Actually, I've seen as well some of those answers in master planning process as a whole. Interestingly, I found the 2 outcomes are interrelated and the 2 processes are interrelated and interlinked, provided Charrette is only a small step in the whole master planning process. Delivery, interestingly, inclusive, positive, productive, time scale, and that's what Sam as well referred to. The second one, speed. Interesting, thinking about the outputs. Yes, guys, it's not about 1 week or 2 weeks Charrette, about us what kind of output we want. Again, happy. For God's sake, my goodness, happy. Happy in engagement and happy in the outputs. Confidence and communication. Problem-solving tools. Leadership, whose responsibility? Realistic and achievable vision. We start saying vision again. Sustainability of the process. Testing measures, keeping strategy together, monitoring and evaluating. Interesting. And that's, by the way, some of the reflection from the audience and Sam as well. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but see, management, mediate, has to be realistic, not just a theater for performance. Do Charrette solve whole town issue, keeping the community together during and after the process. And I just would like to show just reflections as well in the 2 symposium actually. Because we have developed how we move from what I call a linear process into more integrated approach. Moving from installing solutions to what I call it continuous performance for the whole master planning. The biggest questions to me, and I'm not saying here I answer it, what added value does a good master plan bring us? Seriously, what does that mean? The essential link between design and profit. And I'm not saying only profit, return on investment only to the developer. I'm talking profit for the communities. Place should fix capitals, and that's one thing we agreed last time. And that's why it's 3 main things, and that's from their way. Citizen stories, asking what do you want? The scope, it is not about development master planning. And also the impact questions. Do we really understand the impact right from the beginning, at the very early stage of master planning? Asking what, so what? What kind of impact we want to create for the communities? Do we really understand those 3 words? And this is 3 reflections, by the way, seriously I found it from you, not from myself. We need to do things differently. We need to do things, new purpose, a new process, new purpose, and be different by expressing deeply that word value, which is I named it twice or 3 times. Interestingly, I found for the first time from David and as well from Sandy, it is not about consulting. Actually, if we want to achieve true engagement and community engagement, it is the time to think about to be inclusive consensus. That's what David actually mentioned 3 or 4 times in his presentation. It is about win-win situation. We are still, to me personally, on those 2 domains, conflict and compromise. And we're not going to achieve that unless we really bring the community to be partner in the design decision. And again, that's what David mentioned. Community to become partner, but think holistically and to be inclusive. Win-win situation and moving away from conflict and trade-off. And that's what I like about this quotation, ability to develop a collective and deep understanding through dialogue rather than debate. And this is, I hope it's a little bit clear, but this is what David and myself refer about who write the brief and who challenge the brief and what is the role of the community in writing the brief before moving into the master planning or even before even moving to the Charrette process stage. Moving away from linear process to continuous process, or what I call perceptual planning, which is bringing what we call it the 4 Ps, and that's what David referred to. Principles, do we really understand the principles and bring the right principle? The products and the outcomes, and the final delivery. Write the process or processes, because Charrette, one of those instruments, one only, there are many instruments to be included, and what I call it perceptual master planning, a continuous process where we bring monitoring and evaluation. That's the first stage, brief and preparation. See how many issues comes into include. This is what I refer to Charrette. We might need series of Charrette before we jump into what I call selecting and implementation process. So the front is the biggest challenge for us before jumping into solutions, what I call it, and that's what Mark referred to, the early stage of what we call it diagnosis and visioning process. And it has to be interrelated and quick feedback, what I call it balance-seeking process. And that could be through series of Charrette or stakeholders engagement. But I'm not saying this is a controlled process, by the way. This has to be flexible and adaptable for different needs, different demands, and different contexts. And lastly, I would like to thank all of you first, the speakers, Sandy, David, Susan, Barbara, Hina, and Architecture Design Scotland colleagues, Tracy, and Kate, and Maggie. And thanks for all of you, and have a nice weekend.